the long memory of the earth, there are frontiers where history moves slowly, and others where it moves like fire. For more than a century, 121 unbroken years, the frontier between the Kingdom of Hungary and the rising Ottoman Empire became such a place. A line of earth that breathed war. A land where generations were born into fear so old it felt inherited, and where children grew up never knowing a season without danger. The borderlands did not sleep. Not in the 1310s, not in the 1430s, not in the decades that followed. Every dusk came with the same question. Will they come tonight? On the Hungarian plains, the horizon stretched wide and empty. But emptiness was never safe. Peasants learned to read the sky like scripture. They felt danger in the wind, sensed it in the rustling grass, the sudden silence of birds. Mothers hushed their children when night fell. Men walked the perimeters of villages with spears they had inherited from fathers who never lived long enough to grow old. Dogs barked nervously at shadows, because shadows had often swallowed whole families. Frontier life was neither fully peace nor fully war. It was a kind of suspended existency world held between survival and collapse. Wooden palisades stood like brittle ribs around villages, never strong enough to stop an empire, but sturdy enough to buy a few minutes of warning. Bodotawas watched the plains with an anxiety that seeped into every story, every prayer. Fields that fed families in spring might be burned by summer, and winter, cold and soundless, brought only the memory of raids that had come before and would come again. For Hungary, this was more than a frontier. It was the threshold of Europe itself. Chronicles written in dimly lit monasteries repeated the same belief, that Hungary was the eastern shield of Christendom, holding back a force that had already reshaped half the known world. Each chronicler had his own voice, some trembling with fear, others hardened by faith, but all understood the same truth. If this frontier broke, the consequences would echo far beyond its fields and fortresses. So they suit across mountains and rivers. The Ottoman Empire expanded like a tide, slow at fears, then swift, unstoppable. Gathering strength from Anatolia to Thrace, its leaders moved with a clarity of purpose that frightened their rivals. They built armies not from chaos, but from order, discipline, and a sense of destiny. Their institutions, Timmerlands, Janisarikor, Raider Cavalry War, not accidents of history, they were mechanisms, finely tuned and ruthlessly effective. And from the empire's outer edges rode the Akonki, the raiders, the ghosts of the frontier. They were not the Sultan's main armies. They were the wind before the storm. They swept through plains on fast horses, moving with a silence that terrified villages long before the thunder of drums ever reached Hungary's gates. Two peasants on the frontier, they were the warning that the empire itself was not far behind. But warlong war cannot be understood through armies alone. It is felt in human hearts. A peasant family wakes before dawn in a village near Thames. The father loads a wagon with grain, tools, and blankets, because he knows that the moment a distant watchtower fires a signal flame, they may have only minutes to flee. His wife braids their daughter's hair with quick, shaking hands. Their son carries a small wooden cross, carved by a grandfather who died in a raid when the boy was still too young to remember. Their house is not just a home. It is a place prepared for sudden departure. They live ready to run. A Hungarian foot soldier stands on the ramparts of a deteriorating fortress further west. He is not a knight armored in gleaming steel. He is a man hardened by fear and hunger, posted far from the capital, defending a wall patched more times than he can count. His spear is old. His pay is late. The wooden beams beneath his boots groan with every step, yet he watches the border with a pride he does not admit aloud. He believes that if he falls, Europe loses a breath of time it may desperately need. Far across the plains, an Ottoman Akonki rider urges his horse through the darkness. He feels the cold bite of night air on his face. He whispers to his mount, trained to move with near-silent strides. He carries a curved blade and a hardened will, and he rides because he is part of something larger than himself. An empire that expects him to test the strength of the frontier again and again. His life is shaped by speed, by discipline, by the knowledge that the world he serves is expanding and that he rides at its growing edge. In a monastery tucked inside thicker walls, a lone chronicler illuminates a parchment with careful strokes. His hands shake, not from age, but from memory. He has recorded the same story for decades. Villages burned, captains slain fortresses, repaired only to fall again, yet he continues to write. For him, recording suffering is a duty. He believes that if these losses are not written, they will disappear like smoke. And he knows, deep in his heart, that he is chronicling not just events, but in the themes of the frontier intertwine fear, faith, duty, ambition. Fear kept families awake at night. Faith kept them from breaking. Duty kept men on crumbling walls. Ambition fueled an empire moving westward with confidence that history was on its side. And across this charged landscape lay a simple truth. 121 years of war was not a single conflict, but a chain of them each connected, each igniting the next. Some battles lasted hours, others shaped decades. Some victories felt decisive until they were erased by new defeats. Some defeats felt absolute until Hungary rose again, wounded but unbroken, like a phoenix emerging from ashes still warm. Frontiers are not merely places. They are experiences, and on this frontier, the experience was exhaustion that lasted generations. Children who saw raiders in their youth grew into adults who fought battles in their prime and became elders who watched the next generation repeat the cycle. A century is long enough for memory to harden into identity, and along this border, identity became survival. The struggle between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire was not just a military contest. It was a clash of worlds of systems, beliefs, and ways of life. It reshaped villages and cities, noble families and peasant lineages, monasteries and marketplaces. It carved scars into the landscape and the soul of a region that understood war not as an interruption, but as a condition of life. Yet the land did not collapse. Not fully. It bent, but it endured. It burned, but it rose again. It bled, but it refused to die. The frontier hardened into a crucible, forging resilience that astonished even those who witnessed it. And in the long shadow of this resilience, history gathered momentum, preparing to move, preparing to collide forces that had been building for decades. This is where the story begins. At the edge of Europe, at the threshold of an empire, at the border where fear met faith, and where the fate of nations balanced on the decisions of soldiers, peasants, sultans, kings, and wanderers. The tension rises now steady, gathering unbroken, leading us toward the broader story of how these two worlds collided for more than a century. To understand the 121 years of struggle between the Kingdom of Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, one must begin with the land itself. The Carpathian Basin was both a cradle and a corridor, enclosed by mountains on three sides. But open in the south, it was a natural highway for armies sweeping up from the Balkans. The great Hungarian plain stretched outward like an invitation to invaders. For centuries, steppe peoples had crossed its grasslands with ease, and in the minds of Hungarian rulers, there was a memory that never faded. The Mongol invasion of 1241, when entire counties were emptied and castles burned to their foundations. The trauma of that cataclysm carved itself into the Hungarian political psyche. From that moment forward, their kings believed that only strong fortifications, disciplined armies, and eternal vigilance could preserve the kingdom's existence. That vigilance became more than strategy. It became identity. Hungary called itself the shield of Christendom, not out of pride, but out of necessity. No other European kingdom lay so exposed. No other realm held the line between two worlds with such constancy. And when the Ottoman Empire rose in the 14th and 15th centuries, ambitious and relentless, Hungary became the frontier on which the fate of Europe would be tested for 6 generations. Understanding the Ottoman threat requires looking at the engine that powered it. The empire was not a chaotic swarm of raiders. It was an organized machine of conquest. Its sultans inherited a frontier ideology known as Gaza, the notion of holy struggle against non-Muslim powers. Though this idea was far more political than purely religious, it created momentum. Ottoman rulers rewarded warriors, granted lands to loyal cavalrymen, and elevated those who expanded the borders of the realm. Conquest became both duty and opportunity. The result was a state that married faith, pragmatism, and military innovation. The backbone of that military system was the Timur cavalry. These Sipahi horsemen were granted estates in return for military service. Their loyalty was tied not only to the Sultan, but to the prosperity of their landholdings. When the empire expanded, thousands of timurs were distributed across the Balkans, tying local economies to Ottoman military power. Alongside them stood the most feared infantry in the region. The Janissary, recruited through the Devshirm Levia system in which Christian boys were taken, converted, and trained from childhood. They formed the elite corps of the Ottoman army. Their discipline, their use of firearms, and their loyalty to the Sultan made them an unprecedented force in early modern Europe. Logistics, too, played a decisive role. Ottoman armies were able to sustain long campaigns deep into Europe because of an infrastructure of supply depots, road networks, and disciplined administrative systems. What many European states treated as temporary crusading efforts, the Ottomans approached as continuous imperial expansion. While Hungary struggled with noble rebellions, shifting royal successions, and economic strain, the Ottoman war machine advanced steadily, absorbing territory piece by piece. The Balkans became the first battleground. In the 1300s and 1400s, fragmentation defined the region. Serbia, Bosnia, Wallachia, Moldavia, and Croatia navigated a landscape of shifting loyalties, internal rivalries, and existential threats. Some rulers aligned with Hungary for protection, others submitted to Ottoman. Many attempted both, depending on the decade. This political fluidity opened corridors for Ottoman power to move northward with increasing ease. After the Serbian defeated Kosovo in 1389, Ottoman influence surged. When Bosnia fell in 1463, a crucial buffer vanished. Wallachia and Moldavia resisted, sometimes fiercely, but their survival depended on leaders who rose and fell with time. Only Hungary possessed the military and economic weight to challenge the empire directly. This set the stage for a century-long collision between two very different political worlds. Hungary's monarchy was powerful at times, fragile at others. Its kings Louis, the great Sigismund of Luxembourg, Matthias Corvinus, and later the Jagiellons each faced not only the Ottoman threat, but the difficult task of managing a large and sometimes unruly noble class. The frontier lords, known as Ban, Ispan, or simply captains of the marshes, wielded immense local power. They commanded fortresses, raised levies, and negotiated with neighboring states, yet they also competed for influence, wealth, and royal favor, sometimes weakening the very unity needed to withstand Ottoman pressure. Still, Hungary produced some of the finest military leaders of the age. Men like John Hunyadi, who rose from the lesser nobility to become the greatest crusader general of the 15th century. His campaigns pushed deep into the Balkans and slowed the Ottoman advance at critical moments. His son, Matthias Corvinus, built a standing arm of the Black Army unusual for its time. Professional, well-equipped, and loyal to the crown rather than the nobles. For several decades under Matthias, Hungary was strong enough not only to defend itself, but to expand. But after his death in 1490, the kingdom fractured under disputes over succession and aristocratic control. Meanwhile, the Ottomans remained united. Sultans such as Murad I, Bayezid, Mehmed, Dua Salim I, and Suleiman the Magnificent each brought new force to the empire's expansion. Their armies pushed into Anatolia, crushed the last Byzantine defenses, and moved steadily through Europe. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 sent shockwaves across the continent. Many feared that if the Ottomans continued unchecked, Hungary would be next, and behind Hungary, the great cities of Central Europe. The long arc of conflict between the two powers unfolded through phases. At first, in the early 1300s and 1400s, raids formed the rhythm of warfare. Ottoman Akonki-light cavalry struck Hungarian borderlands swiftly, burned villages, and retreated before defenders could gather. Hungarian counter-raids mirrored this brutality, creating a cycle of violence that shaped frontier life for generations. Then came the great battles. In 1396, the crusading army of Europe was crushed at Later, Hunyadi's victories at Belgrade offered a brief reversal. But by the late 1400s and early 1500s, the Ottoman pressure became overwhelming. The decisive blow fell in 1526 at Mohács, where the Hungarian army collapsed under the force of Suleiman's invasion. King Louis II died on the battlefield, and the kingdom fractured. One part fell under direct Ottoman control. Another became a Habsburg possession, forming Royal Hungary. The Central Plains, once the heart of the kingdom, became a battleground for over a century. Society transformed under the strain. Entire counties were depopulated. Frontier soldiers formed unique communities hardened by constant danger. Nobles abandoned ancestral lands. Some villages vanished forever, while others rebuilt, only to be destroyed again. Religious life changed as well. Catholicism remained dominant in Royal Hungary, but Protestant ideas spread quickly in regions destabilized by war. Under Ottoman rule, Christians retained their faith, but paid heavy taxes, creating a layered coexistence marked by both tolerance and hardship. Economies collapsed and revived in cycles that matched the tempo of war. Livestock replaced grain in many regions because cattle could be driven quickly from raiders. Fortresses became the centers of local life, not towns. Everything bent itself towards survival. Yet resilience defined the land as much as destruction. Despite losses, Hungarian identity hardened rather than dissolved. The wars forged new political structures, new alliances, and new heroes. The Ottoman Empire, too, reshaped the region administratively, culturally, economically, leaving traces that remain visible in Eastern Europe. Even today, by the end of these 121 years, the frontier between Christian and Ottoman worlds had become one of the most fortified and fiercely defended borders on Earth. The struggles of this era helped shape modern Hungary, Croatia, Serbia, Romania, and Slovakia. It created cultural memories that endured for centuries. And so, the story begins in the early decades of the 14th century, when the first pressures from the south began to stir, when the Ottoman foothold in the Balkans was uncertain, and when Hungary still believed it could contain the storm that was rising beyond its borders. The early 1300s in the Kingdom of Hungary were defined by tension, vigilance, and survival. Along the southern and eastern borders, the land stretched across plains and low hills, forming a delicate frontier that separated Christendom from the rising Ottoman power in the Balkans. This was a land constantly on edge, where every dawn brought the possibility of invasion, and every night was haunted by rumors of raiders moving across distant forests and rivers. Families learned to hide valuables, to corral livestock, and to flee when the sound of hooves approached. Children grew up learning strategies of survival before they had even learned to read. Women preserved food, repaired homes, and instructed the next generation in the ways of endurance. Every day was measured against the possibility of violence, and every small success in survival was celebrated quietly, often unrecorded in official chronicles. The soldiers who defended Hungary's frontier were a mixture of professional knights, local levies, and mercenary contingents. Life for these men was harsh. They trained constantly, patrolled the plains, and maintained vigilance over long stretches of land with minimal resources. Many of them were conscripts drawn from the very villages they were sworn to protect, expected to fight alongside their families while also tending crops and performing other labor. Their presence provided a measure of security, but the raiders' speed and unpredictability meant that even the most disciplined garrisons could be caught unprepared. Discipline, courage, and improvisation were essential qualities, and the frontier soldiers became a specialized population whose lives were defined by tension and danger. The Akonki were swift and intelligent in their operations. Unlike conventional armies that relied on siege and occupation, these raiders emphasized mobility. Every raid left communities destabilized, and the cumulative effect of repeated incursions shaped both local society and the strategic thinking of Hungarian leaders. Fortresses and watchtowers were reinforced. Militia training became a daily priority, and villagers developed early warning systems to signal approaching raiders. The chroniclers of the era provide a vivid record of these tensions. Monks and scribes, often located in monasteries and abbeys, just beyond the reach of the frontier, documented not only the movements of armies and raiders, but the human toll of the conflict. Charles I and his successors pursued fortification projects, raised professional troops, and sought to consolidate central authority over the nobility, whose private armies were essential, yet sometimes unreliable. Yet resources were limited, and political fragmentation meant that coordination across the frontier was often inconsistent. Religious life intertwined with survival. Prayers, rituals, and devotion were believed to offer protection. Saints and relics were venerated as guardians against violence. Monks and priests provided moral support, chronicled events, and offered guidance to populations under duress. Spiritual practice was inseparable from the political and military realities of life along the frontier. By the mid-14th century, the Ottoman Empire had established itself as a formidable presence in Thrace, steadily consolidating control over the lands that had once been under Byzantine influence. The Ottomans' expansion into the Balkans was deliberate, methodical, and increasingly sophisticated. Their campaigns were no longer confined to small raiding parties. They had begun constructing fortifications, establishing garrisons, and integrating local populations into their administrative and military systems. This growing presence in Thrace sent ripples of concern through the courts of Europe, but none felt the threat more immediately than the Kingdom of Hungary, whose southern borders now faced a power both disciplined and relentless. Hungary's position in the 1350s was precarious, yet strategically critical. The kingdom occupied the Carpathian Basin, a fertile and expansive region that formed a natural gateway between Western Europe and the Balkans. Hungarian kings recognized that their realm was more than a sovereign territory. It was a defensive shield for the Christian world. Every river, hill, and forest along the southern frontier was a potential route for invaders. The need for vigilance was heightened by the political fragmentation of the surrounding Balkan states. Serbia, weakened by dynastic struggles and civil war, struggled to maintain coherent authority. Bosnia, though mountainous and difficult to penetrate, was politically divided and occasionally aligned with powers hostile to Hungarian interests. Wallachia and Moldavia, caught between Hungarian influence and Ottoman pressure, were compelled to navigate an increasingly treacherous diplomatic landscape. During this period, Hungary sought to secure alliances and exercise influence over the Balkan principalities to create a buffer zone against Ottoman incursions. Relations with Serbia were of particular importance. The Serbian kingdom, once a regional power capable of projecting influence across the Balkans, had fractured following the death of Tsar Stefan Uruswa and the decline of central authority. Hungarian diplomacy sought to stabilize Serbia, offering protection and support to factions willing to resist Ottoman advances. In return, Hungary hoped for a cooperative frontier that could act as an early warning system and a first line of resistance against raiders. Yet this diplomacy was fraught with uncertainty. Serbian nobles were often divided among themselves, with some willing to submit to the Ottomans to preserve their estates or gain personal advantage. The Hungarian crown had to balance assertiveness with careful negotiation, aware that a misstep could leave its southern borders exposed. Meanwhile, the Ottomans were testing the limits of Hungary's defensive strategies. Their incursions into Thrace demonstrated not only military capability but also strategic foresight. The deployment of Akonki raiders had evolved into coordinated operations designed to gather intelligence, seize resources, and assess Hungarian defenses. These raids were no longer mere forays into unpopulated regions. They were systematic probes into the kingdom's vulnerabilities. Hungarian chroniclers recorded tales of border settlements being attacked with increasing frequency, fortified towns threatened by the speed and mobility of the raiders, and isolated villages forced to rely on their own resourcefulness for survival. The psychological impact of these incursions was profound, instilling a sense of persistent danger among frontier communities, and compelling the Hungarian crown to prioritize both fortification and military readiness. The first major confrontations between Hungarian forces and Ottoman units began to take shape during this era. While Hungary had long dealt with raiding parties, the mid-14th century marked a shift toward larger-scale engagements. Hungarian kings, understanding the strategic stakes, began to assemble forces capable of not only defending territory but also countering Ottoman advances preemptively. Fortresses along the southern border were reinforced, garrisons increased, and mobile cavalry units trained to respond quickly to incursions. Despite these measures, the Ottomans' combination of speed, intelligence gathering, and experience in Balkan warfare posed a challenge, unlike any Hungary had previously encountered. The geography of the region compounded these challenges. The plains of southern Hungary, while providing open fields for cavalry, also exposed defenders to sudden attacks and limited avenues for retreat. Rivers such as the Danube and Drava offered natural barriers, but their crossings were predictable points of vulnerability. Forests could conceal both defenders and attackers, and the rolling hills provided vantage points for reconnaissance and ambush. In this complex terrain, every encounter between Hungarian forces and Ottoman raiders became a test of adaptability, strategy, and endurance. Society along the frontier was profoundly shaped by these early collisions. Villages, aware of the increasing likelihood of attacks, fortified themselves further. Families divided labor between subsistence and defense, and local militias became central to community survival. The chroniclers of the period noted that even routine activities harvesting grain, tending livestock, or traveling between settlements required vigilance. Markets and fairs were conducted under the watchful eye of armed guards, and trade was often limited to safer corridors where raiding parties were less likely to strike. The constant pressure of potential attack molded a culture of preparedness and resilience that would characterize the Hungarian frontier for decades to come. Religious institutions also played a vital role during this time. Monks, priests, and abbots provided spiritual support, but they also offered practical guidance for survival. They chronicled raids, maintained records of losses, and sometimes acted as intermediaries in negotiations with neighboring powers. Their writings preserved the human dimension of the conflict, detailing not only the movements of armies, but the endurance, ingenuity, and suffering of ordinary people. Through these records, modern historians can glimpse the ways in which life on the frontier was simultaneously constrained by fear and enriched by communal solidarity. The political dimension of these early confrontations was equally significant. Hungarian kings and nobles understood that the Ottoman threat was not merely a matter of raiding, but represented a long-term challenge to sovereignty and regional influence. Efforts to strengthen fortifications, organize local militias, and conduct reconnaissance were complemented by diplomatic initiatives aimed at securing alliances and managing rivalries in the Balkans. Negotiations with Serbian and Bosnian leaders sought to stabilize buffer zones, encourage cooperation, and prevent the Ottomans from exploiting internal divisions. These initiatives, however, were often complicated by the fluid loyalties of local rulers, the ambitions of Hungarian magnates, and the unpredictable nature of Ottoman expansion. By the mid-14th century, the stage was set for larger-scale conflict. The early incursions, while limited in scope, revealed the strategic thinking and operational capacity of the Ottoman forces. Hungarian responses, meanwhile, demonstrated the kingdom's ability to mobilize resources, coordinate defenses, and adapt to a novel and persistent threat. The interplay of raiders and defenders created a dynamic in which every decision, from the allocation of troops to the construction of fortifications, had immediate consequences for survival and long-term implications for regional security. Economic conditions in the frontier regions were shaped by this environment. Repeated incursions disrupted agriculture, trade, and artisanal production. Villages were forced to balance subsistence needs with defensive requirements, and the cumulative effect of these pressures contributed to population movements. The consolidation of settlements around fortresses and the emergence of specialized frontier communities. Soldiers and peasants alike developed skills in logistics, fortification, and rapid response that would be essential in the prolonged conflicts of the 5th, 10th, and 16th centuries. The early clashes also highlighted the importance of leadership and initiative. Local commanders who could anticipate raiding patterns, respond quickly to threats, and maintain morale became critical to frontier defense. Similarly, Ottoman leaders demonstrated remarkable flexibility, combining intelligence, mobility, and psychological pressure to exploit weaknesses. Each encounter provided lessons for both sides, gradually shaping the tactics, strategies, and institutions that would define Hungarian-Ottoman warfare for the next century. Culture and identity on the frontier were intertwined with these confrontations. Communities defined themselves not only by kinship and land, but also by their capacity for endurance and resistance. Stories of raids, heroic stands, and survival were passed down orally and recorded in chronicles, contributing to a collective memory that reinforced solidarity and purpose. Religious devotion, martial skill, and communal cohesion became intertwined, creating a frontier society deeply aware of the stakes of survival in a world dominated by the pressures of war. By the end of the mid-14th century, the first collisions between Hungary and the Ottomans had already begun to leave their mark on the kingdom. The raids were no longer isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern of pressure that would escalate into full-scale campaigns. Hungarian defensive strategies had begun to evolve, combining fortifications, professional troops, local militias, and diplomatic engagement. The frontier was now an arena where tactical decisions had profound social, economic, and political consequences. The Kingdom's response to these early challenges would set the framework for the sustained conflict that would follow in the decades to come. These early confrontations demonstrated that the Hungarian frontier was not simply a line on a map, but a living, dynamic space where human ingenuity, courage, and endurance were constantly tested. Every raid, every diplomatic initiative, and every defensive measure contributed to a deeper understanding of the Ottoman threat and Hungary's capacity to resist it. The mid-14th century thus represents the first chapter in a centuries-long struggle, a period in which patterns of conflict, adaptation, and survival were established and would echo through the long years of frontier warfare. The first collisions between Hungary and the Ottomans in the mid-1300s were a proving ground for strategies, both defensive and offensive. They revealed vulnerabilities, tested alliances, and shaped the expectations of both rulers and subjects. They also marked the beginning of a transformation in frontier society, as villages became militarized, fortresses reinforced, and communities adapted to the demands of a border constantly under threat. The lessons of these decades would inform Hungarian military and political strategy for generations, forming the foundation for the more intense confrontations that awaited in the later 14th and 15th centuries. Hungary's frontier in this period was thus a crucible of experience, a space where ordinary people, soldiers, nobles, and chroniclers were all participants in an unfolding story of endurance, adaptation, and resistance. The pressures of geographies, politics, and the growing Ottoman presence created a dynamic environment in which every decision mattered. The mid-14th century confrontations set a clear trajectory. Hungary would face an expanding, organized Ottoman presence, alliances. And the patterns established during this period would echo across generations of soldiers, villagers, and leaders alike. These incursions were designed to weaken Hungarian defenses, disrupt local economies, and create fear that would undermine both civilian morale and noble loyalty. Frontier settlements were caught in a recurring cycle of destruction and reconstruction, adapting to survive yet never achieving lasting security. The frequency and scale of these raids reflected the growing capability of the Ottoman state, signaling that Hungary's frontier would face continuous pressure in the decades ahead. Recognizing the need for systemic change, Sigismund initiated a series of fortification reforms. Wooden palisades and hastily built towers were replaced or reinforced with stone walls, and the design of fortresses evolved to withstand artillery and organized assault. Key border towns were expanded with multiple defensive layers, including moats, bastions, and garrison gates. Nobles were encouraged, and sometimes compelled, to maintain armed forces ready for rapid deployment. Local militias were reorganized, trained, and incorporated into a larger strategic framework under royal oversight. The reforms reflected a growing understanding that defense could no longer be a purely local matter. It required coordination, logistics, and planning at the national level. These fortification reforms were closely linked to social and economic structures. Villages were reorganized around fortified centers, and communities contributed labor, materials, and provisions to the construction and maintenance of defenses. Agricultural schedules were adjusted to accommodate the demands of security, and the presence of garrisons brought new economic dynamics, including demand for supplies, wages for soldiers, and the growth of markets near fortifications. Frontier life became increasingly militarized, blending survival, labor, and defense into a continuous cycle. Diplomatic efforts complemented these internal reforms. Sigismund pursued alliances with neighboring powers to stabilize Hungary's southern borders. Relations with Wallachia, Moldavia, and the remnants of Serbian and Bosnian authority were carefully negotiated to prevent Ottoman penetration and to secure cooperation in intelligence and military matters. At the same time, the crown sought to manage internal noble rivalries that could undermine collective defense. Nobles who controlled key borderlands were incentivized through land grants, privileges, and political recognition, binding their military obligations to the broader strategic goals of the kingdom. The human dimension of this period cannot be overstated. Villagers endured repeated disruptions to their lives, balancing the need for subsistence with the requirements of defense. Children were educated in survival skills and religious instruction, preparing them for a world in which conflict was ever present. This systematic approach reflected lessons learned from prior decades. The frontier required preparation, integration, and foresight to counter an enemy whose mobility and discipline were increasingly effective. Economically, the intensifying raids and fortification projects imposed both burdens and opportunities. Construction of stone walls, moats, and bastions required labor, materials, and financing, drawing on the resources of both the crown and local communities. Simultaneously, repeated Ottoman incursions disrupted trade routes, destroyed crops, and forced communities to adapt to cyclical loss and reconstruction. The frontier became an environment in which survival, economy, and military readiness were inseparably linked. The kingdom was no longer facing isolated raiding parties, but a coherent, expanding empire with strategic objectives in Central Europe. Hungary's response fortifying towns, reorganizing military structures, and stabilizing diplomatic relations demonstrated both the severity of the threat and the capacity of the kingdom to adapt. Villages, fortresses, and regional militias were integrated into a broader defensive network. The lessons learned during this period, the importance of fortification, coordinated command, and social resilience would inform Hungary's strategies in the intense conflicts of the 15th and 16th centuries. The age of Sigismund thus represents the beginning of Hungary's transformation from a reactive kingdom to a state capable of structured, proactive defense. The Hungarian frontier under Sigismund was a crucible in which the pressures of geography, politics, and military threat combined to shape society, culture, and identity. Villagers endured raids, soldiers honed defensive techniques, and the crown worked to unify disparate elements into a coherent system of resistance. Fortresses rose, garrisons expanded, and frontier communities became increasingly disciplined and organized. In Interlude, the first enduring structures of what would become a century-long frontier defense system were firmly established, demonstrating the capacity of Hungary to survive in the face of a determined, expanding Ottoman presence. The army assembled at Nicopolis in 3096 was formidable on paper. Hungarian forces formed the core, supported by contingents from France, Burgundy, and Wallachia. Nobles brought heavily armored knights, seasoned in European warfare. Infantry units, though less disciplined than the knights, provided numerical strength and versatility. Supply lines were established, albeit precariously, and the sheer size of the army conveyed a message of Christian solidarity. Yet, despite its apparent strength, the crusading force faced inherent vulnerabilities. Coordination among multinational contingents was difficult. Discipline varied, and experience against Ottoman tactics, particularly their use of light cavalry, ambushes, and feigned retreats, was limited. The Ottomans, under Sultan Bazidai, had anticipated the possibility of a major confrontation. They were not merely defenders, but active strategists. Ottoman forces combined disciplined infantry, elite janissaries, and the mobility of cavalry units to create flexible battle formations. The aftermath of Nicopolis rippled across the kingdom. Refugees fled southward, bringing news of the carnage and spreading fear. Nobles who survived reconsidered their obligations and alliances. Frontier militias and garrisons were reinforced in anticipation of further Ottoman advances. Sigismund himself, shaken by the scale of defeat, intensified efforts to reform military organization, fortification systems, and diplomatic alliances. Nicopolis served as a stark lesson. Traditional European tactics, valor, and numerical superiority alone could not secure the southern frontier. Adaptation, discipline, intelligence, and preparation were now paramount. Society along Hungary's borderlands experienced both practical and psychological consequences. The frontier, already a space of constant tension, became a laboratory in which lessons of survival, organization, and endurance were codified for future generations. The events surrounding Nicopolis illustrate the interplay between military disaster and societal adaptation. The battlefield loss exposed vulnerabilities in European strategy and Hungarian preparedness, but it also catalyzed reforms, innovation, and resilience. Frontier communities, hardened by decades of raids and instability, became more organized, disciplined, and psychologically prepared for the long struggle ahead. Nobles and kings alike learned that coordination, foresight, and institutional reform were essential to survival. The patterns established in the wake of Nicopolis fortification, militia organization, intelligence, and adaptive strategy would define Hungary's approach to Ottoman confrontation for the next century. For leaders and soldiers, it demonstrated the importance of discipline, coordination, and understanding of enemy tactics. For Hungary as a whole, it marked a clear inflection point. The realization that the Ottoman Empire was not a distant threat, but a formidable neighbor whose expansion could only be countered through strategic foresight, organized defense, and the integration of society into a broader system of resistance. The disaster of 1396 was thus a crucible. It transformed the Hungarian frontier from a zone of reactive defense into a laboratory of adaptation, reform, and endurance. From the ashes of Nicopolis, Hungary began to develop the structures, strategies, and mindset that would guide its responses to Ottoman pressure over the coming century. The frontier became simultaneously a space of fear and resilience, of challenge and opportunity, where lessons learned through catastrophe would shape generations of soldiers, nobles, and villagers alike. The turn of the 15th century brought a temporary reprieve for Hungary's beleaguered frontier, but it was a reprieve born of chaos, not of conquest. In 1402, the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I, architect of the empire's rapid expansion across the Balkans, faced an existential challenge from the east. Timur, the Central Asian conqueror, whose campaigns had devastated Persia, Anatolia, and beyond, marched into Ottoman territory with overwhelming force. The confrontation culminated in the Battle of Ankara, a cataclysmic clash that shattered the Ottoman army and captured Bayezid himself. The consequences were immediate and profound. The Ottoman Empire plunged into civil war, known as the Interregnum, as rival princes Bayezid's sons contended for the throne. For Hungary, this period of Ottoman disarray offered a window of temporary relief, a pause in the relentless pressure that had defined the previous decades. The significance of Bayezid's defeat cannot be overstated. For more than a century, Hungary had borne the brunt of Ottoman expansion, absorbing raids, enduring sieges, and managing the consequences of frontier conquerators still moved with skill and audacity, but the central Ottoman command that had coordinated large-scale campaigns was fractured. Regional governors pursued personal agendas, alliances shifted, and large-scale invasions into Hungarian territory were delayed or abandoned. For the first time in decades, frontier communities could breathe without the immediate threat of overwhelming Ottoman forces descending upon them. This temporary relief did not mean the end of vigilance. Hungarian kings understood that the interregnum was a fragile opportunity, and frontier reorganization became a top priority. The lessons of Nicopolis, earlier raids, and the collapse of neighboring states informed every strategic decision. Sigismund of Luxembourg, now firmly established as both King of Hungary and Holy Roman Emperor, sought to capitalize on this lull, to strengthen defenses, consolidate authority over the nobility, and institutionalize military preparedness along the southern border. Fortresses were repaired and expanded, garrisons reinforced, and communication networks between towns and castles improved. The frontier was reorganized not merely as a line of defense, but as a network of interdependent nodes capable of rapid response to renewed threats. At the village level, life continued under a combination of resilience and anxiety. Farmers returned to fields long abandoned during periods of raiding, rebuilding homes and livestock stocks. Local militias trained more systematically, coordinated by regional captains under royal oversight. Monks and chroniclers, who had previously recorded the horrors of raids and battles, now documented reconstruction, fortification efforts, and the slow return of stability. Communities adapted to the lessons learned over decades. Early warning signals, fortified refuges, and coordinated defense protocols became part of the routine. Children grew up with knowledge of both survival techniques and civic duty, instilling in the next generation a sense of responsibility toward maintaining the security of their settlements. Hungary's frontier reorganization during this period was also strategic in a broader political sense. Sigismund recognized that the fractured Ottoman state offered a chance not only to reinforce defenses, but to assert influence over neighboring Balkan territories. Diplomatic initiatives with Wallachia, Moldavia, and the remnants of Serbian and Bosnian authorities were intensified. Alliances were sought to secure buffer zones and intelligence channels, ensuring that the temporary Ottoman weakness could be leveraged to create a more stable southern frontier. Nobles controlling key territories were incentivized through land grants and privileges to participate actively in these strategic reforms. Economically, the interregnum provided relief, but also opportunities for development. Villages previously disrupted by raids experienced a modest resurgence. Trade routes reopened, markets revived, and agricultural production stabilized. Investment in fortifications and garrisons generated employment for craftsmen, laborers, and soldiers, creating a dynamic in which security and economic recovery were intertwined. This period demonstrated the interdependence of military preparedness and economic stability, illustrating how frontier communities could capitalize on temporary political shifts to rebuild both infrastructure and morale. Despite these advantages, the interregnum was not without risk. The Ottoman Civil War produced unpredictable actors, regional commanders, rival princes, and opportunistic warlords, any of whom could launch raids independently of a central authority. While large-scale invasions were delayed, localized attacks persisted, requiring continued vigilance. Hungarian leaders could not afford complacency. Every fortress, watchtower, and patrol represented a critical link in a chain of defense that had to remain functional even amid temporary peace. The frontier remained a space defined by anticipation, adaptation, and the constant preparation for the return of more organized Ottoman campaigns. Sigismund's reforms during this period laid the groundwork for the next century of frontier warfare. Fortresses were redesigned to withstand artillery. Garrisons were trained for coordinated maneuvers, and communication networks were established to allow rapid transmission of intelligence across long stretches of borderland. Soldiers, both professional and conscripted, were disciplined in ways that reflected lessons learned from past failures. Local populations, meanwhile, were incorporated into the defense system through militia training, fortification, labor, and strategic relocation of vulnerable villages to safer areas. The frontier had become a living organism, defensive, resilient, and adaptive to the evolving threat of Ottoman resurgence. At the human level, the interregnum revealed the extraordinary capacity of frontier communities to endure cycles of devastation and reconstruction. Chroniclers of the time documented the quiet heroism of ordinary people. Families returning to rebuild homes, villagers collaborating to reinforce walls, and soldiers maintaining readiness even in periods of relative calm. Religious life reinforced these communal efforts, blending faith with practical survival. Monks and priests provided both moral and logistical guidance, instructing communities in fortification, maintenance, rationing of resources, and spiritual resilience. Cultural and religious continuity became an essential component of defense, reinforcing social cohesion in a landscape defined by uncertainty. The political ramifications of Bayezid's defeat also reverberated within Hungary itself. Nobles who had previously resisted central authority were now more willing to cooperate with Sigismund's reforms, recognizing the benefits of unified command and coordinated defense. Frontier captains gained authority, resources, and prestige, establishing a professionalized layer of leadership that would be critical in the decades to come. The interregnum demonstrated that even temporary disruptions in an adversary's power could have lasting effects if leveraged wisely. Hungary strengthened not only its defenses, but also its governance, social organization, and strategic foresight. Yet, the relief was finite. While the Ottoman civil war fractured their central command, the empire remained resilient. Princes contested succession with varying degrees of success, maintaining forces in Anatolia and the Balkans, while conquest raids continued sporadically, and the potential for renewed large-scale campaigns remained. Hungarian leaders understood that the interregnum was not an opportunity for complacency, but a brief window to prepare for the inevitability of renewed pressure. The frontier, strengthened during this period, would soon face the consequences of Ottoman recovery, as the lessons of Bayezid's defeat would be tested by the ambitions of his successors. The interregnum period underscores the cyclical nature of frontier conflict. Hungary experienced both devastation and reprieve, learning to exploit moments of advantage while preparing for inevitable resurgence. The frontier became an arena in which military, political, economic, and social strategies were integrated. Fortresses were not merely stone structures, but symbols of resilience. Militias were not merely armed peasants, but participants in a broader system of defense. Villages were not merely places of subsistence, but nodes in a network of survival and adaptation. The Hungarian frontier of the early 15th century illustrates the interplay between external threat, internal organization, and human endurance in the face of long-term conflict. In sum, the interregnum and Ottoman civil war provided Hungary with a temporary respite, but also a critical opportunity for strategic consolidation. Frontier defenses were strengthened, military organization professionalized, and local populations integrated into systems of resilience. Diplomacy with neighboring Balkan states reinforced buffer zones and intelligence channels, while economic recovery allowed communities to rebuild after decades of raids. The lessons learned during this period would prove essential as the Ottoman Empire recovered from internal strife and resumed its expansion into the Balkans and Hungary in the decades that followed. The period of temporary Hungarian relief after Bayezid's defeat represents a crucial chapter in the evolution of the Hungarian-Ottoman frontier. It demonstrates how political disruption in an enemy state can create space for adaptation, reform, and consolidation. Frontier communities, soldiers, and leadership all adapted to the interregnum, using the interval to strengthen defenses, improve coordination, and prepare psychologically, socially, and militarily for the next phase of conflict. These developments would shape the character of Hungarian frontier warfare for the remainder of the 15th century and set the stage for renewed confrontation with a recovering and increasingly determined Ottoman Empire. The response from Hungary, under the leadership of King Ladislaus, the posthumous and the rising influence of John Hunyadi, began to take shape as more sophisticated and coordinated than in earlier centuries. Hunyadi, a seasoned military commander and frontier noble, understood both the geography of the Carpathian Basin and the tactics of the Ottoman war machine. He emphasized mobility, rapid response, and intelligence gathering along the frontier, integrating local militias, garrisons, and fortified towns into a cohesive defense network. His approach reflected the lessons of prior defeats, most notably the catastrophic Crusade of Nicopolis, and the fragile relief offered by the Ottoman Interlude. Hunyadi's rise coincided with a crucial transformation in Hungarian military strategy. For decades, frontier defense had relied on local militias, ad hoc alliances with Balkan principalities, and the static strength of fortified towns. Under Hunyadi's influence, Hungarian forces became more proactive, pursuing raids into Ottoman-held territory, intercepting raiding parties before they could return home, and coordinating multi-front campaigns designed to delay Ottoman advances. Murad II's Balkan campaigns provoked a cycle of cross-border reprisals. Each Ottoman incursion prompted Hungarian retaliation, with forces crossing into Serbian and Bosnian territories to disrupt supply lines, attack garrisons, and relieve besieged settlements. The frontier had become a dynamic battlefield, where mobility, intelligence, and local knowledge were as critical as armor and fortifications. Villages were caught in a relentless cycle, one moment preparing for defense against an Ottoman raid, the next contributing men, supplies, and intelligence for counter-operations into enemy territory. Life along the frontier had become inseparable from the rhythms of war. Hunyadi's campaigns also highlighted the importance of leadership in frontier society. He inspired loyalty among soldiers and peasants alike, blending personal bravery with organizational skill. Chronicles describe him riding ahead of columns, scouting terrain, and personally directing the placement of artillery and infantry during engagements. His presence reassured frontier communities, reinforcing the belief that the kingdom could not only survive Ottoman pressure, but, when executed carefully, push back against incursions. Under his guidance, villages and garrisons began to view themselves as integrated components of a broader strategic plan rather than isolated pockets of resistance. The social impact of renewed Ottoman expansion was profound. Villages continued to rebuild after each raid, fortifying homes, establishing watchposts, and training militias. Children grew up under a regimen that combined farming, craft skills, and the rudiments of military service. Monks and priests recorded these daily realities, blending spiritual instruction with practical guidance, ensuring that communities maintained both faith and functionality. Life along the frontier was defined by dual imperatives: survival in the immediate moment and preparation for the next inevitable confrontation. Economically, the mid-1400s were a period of adaptation. Repeated campaigns disrupted trade and agriculture, yet communities discovered strategies to mitigate losses. Crops were diversified, livestock moved to safer pastures, and fortified markets developed near garrisons, creating hubs of commerce even under threat. Craftsmen contributed to both economic and defensive needs, producing weapons, repairing walls, and reinforcing gates. The frontier's economy became a hybrid system, simultaneously sustaining life and enabling ongoing military preparedness. The psychological consequences of Murad II's campaigns were significant. The Ottoman military machine, previously perceived as a distant threat, now operated with efficiency, discipline, and relentless pressure. Frontier communities learned the dual nature of fear. It could paralyze, but it could also galvanize. Stories of skirmishes, heroic stands, and narrow escapes were told and retold, reinforcing vigilance and forging a sense of collective identity defined by endurance, courage, and strategic awareness. Faith became intertwined with defense. Saints were invoked. Religious festivals reinforced communal cohesion, and prayers for protection became as practical as maintaining watchtowers. Murad II's renewed expansion into the Balkans also forced Hungary to refine its diplomatic strategy. Alliances with Wallachia, Moldavia, and the remnants of Serbian and Bosnian authorities were critical. The Ottomans sought to exploit divisions among these states, using diplomacy and coercion to secure allegiance or neutralize opposition. Hungary, in response, deployed envoys, forged treaties, and occasionally supported local rebellions to maintain a buffer against the advancing empire. This interplay of diplomacy, military action, and frontier defense reflected the increasingly sophisticated nature of conflict in the region. The era also highlighted technological and tactical Hunyadi's Forces adopted artillery, defensive bastions, and mobile cavalry tactics specifically designed to counter Ottoman maneuverability. Siege engines were improved, garrison rotation optimized, and communication between frontier forts formalized. Meanwhile, the Ottomans combined traditional cavalry raids with infantry formations and artillery support, creating a multi-layered offensive capability. Battles became contests not merely of strength but of coordination, intelligence, and adaptability, and every engagement provided lessons that shaped future campaigns. The human cost of renewed Ottoman expansion remained high. Frontier populations endured raids, conscription, and displacement, even as they participated in defensive or retaliatory operations. Chroniclers recorded the hardships of peasants forced into labor for fortification, the bravery of soldiers in delaying Ottoman advances, and the spiritual sustenance provided by monks and priests. Life along the frontier was inseparable from the military cycle: preparation, conflict, recovery, and adaptation. Villages and towns became fortified nodes of both habitation and military infrastructure. Hunyadi's leadership ensured that frontier society was not merely reactive, but capable of shaping the operational environment to its advantage. Cross-border reprisals, while disruptive, served multiple strategic purposes. They forced the Ottomans to divert resources, created opportunities to reclaim lost territory, and provided practical experience to frontier forces. They also reinforced social cohesion, as communities participated directly in the defense and counteroffensive. The interplay of offensive and defensive operations created a dynamic frontier culture, one in which resilience, initiative, and adaptation were essential survival skills. By the mid-15th century, Hungary had learned that survival on the frontier required integration across multiple domains: military organization, social cohesion, economic adaptation, and strategic diplomacy. The campaigns of Murad II and the leadership of John Hunyadi illustrated the evolving nature of conflict. The Ottoman Empire was no longer a distant force. It operated with strategic sophistication, exploiting both opportunity and weakness. Hungary responded not merely with fortresses, but with an integrated, adaptable, and proactive system of defense, combining courage, discipline, and foresight. The mid-1400s thus marked a pivotal period in the Hungarian-Ottoman frontier. Murad II's Balkan campaigns demonstrated the renewed power and organizational capacity of the Ottoman state. Hunyadi's leadership, fortified garrisons, and organized frontier militias illustrated Hungary's evolving ability to resist, delay, and occasionally counteract Ottoman advances. Cross-border reprisals became a normalized element of warfare, reflecting the symbiotic relationship between offense and defense along a border defined by constant tension. In sum, the period of renewed Ottoman expansion under Murad II reshaped the southern frontier of Hungary. It forced the kingdom to adapt structurally, socially, and psychologically. Life on the border was defined by vigilance, preparedness, and resilience. Leadership, particularly that of John Hunyadi, provided a template for integrating frontier society into a coherent system capable of withstanding the pressures of a disciplined, determined adversary. These developments would set the stage for the great sieges, heroic stands, and long-term defensive campaigns of the late 15th and early 16th centuries, when Hungary would confront the Ottoman Empire at its height. By the mid-15th century, the Ottoman Empire had regained its momentum following internal turmoil, with Sultan Mehmed II consolidating power in both Anatolia and the Balkans. Europe watched nervously as reports filtered north. The Sultan, victor of Constantinople in 1453, was preparing to push further into Central Europe. His sights rested on the Kingdom of Hungary, whose southern frontier had long been the bulwark of Christendom. The city of Belgrade, strategically positioned at the confluence of the Danube and Sava rivers, emerged as the pivotal point in the coming struggle. Its fate would determine whether the Ottoman advance could be slowed, halted, or even reversed. And for Hungary, the stakes could not have been higher. Belgrade's fortifications, though formidable, were tested like never before. Cannon fire, siege engines, and the overwhelming numbers of Ottoman troops were directed against its walls with unrelenting precision. The defenders, led by John Hunyadi, prepared meticulously. Hunyadi, seasoned by decades of frontier warfare and the bitter lessons of Nicopolis, understood that courage alone would not suffice. Strategic ingenuity, discipline, and the coordination of both professional soldiers and local militias would be critical. He reinforced the walls, organized supply lines, and marshaled volunteers from surrounding towns and villages, emphasizing both defense and morale. The Ottoman army, commanded personally by Mehmed II, brought unprecedented siege technology to bear. Heavy artillery battered the walls, attempting to create breaches through which infantry and cavalry could pour. Archers and janissaries maintained pressure, probing for weaknesses. The city's defenders faced relentless bombardment, and every day presented the threat of collapse. Yet, Hunyadi's leadership proved decisive. Using his knowledge of siegecraft, he orchestrated sorties to disrupt Ottoman positions, repaired breaches under fire, and coordinated counterattacks that leveraged the city's geography and fortifications to maximum effect. Hunyadi's ability to unify disparate forces proved vital. Volunteers, local militias, and professional soldiers, some seasoned veterans of prior campaigns, fought alongside him, creating a cohesive defensive effort. Supplies were rationed carefully, and citizens participated directly in maintaining fortifications, transporting provisions, and supporting the military effort. Religious devotion fueled morale. Monks and priests led prayers, while reports of visions and divine protection inspired defenders to resist exhaustion and despair. Belgrade became more than a fortress. It became the symbolic heart of Hungarian resilience, a bastion whose survival would reverberate across Europe. The siege tested every dimension of defensive strategy. Hunyadi implemented rotations to prevent exhaustion among the defenders, coordinated archers and artillery to maximize counterfire, and anticipated Ottoman maneuvers designed to exploit weaknesses in the city's layout. Hunyadi's ability to integrate professional soldiers with volunteers and militias exemplified a frontier society adapting to existential threats. Civilians were not passive observers. Their labor, vigilance, and courage contributed materially to the city's survival. Monks chronicled the siege in vivid detail, recording how women and children participated in reinforcing walls, distributing water, and tending to the wounded. Belgrade became a living testament to the integration of military, civic, and spiritual life in defense of the frontier. The aftermath of the siege had profound consequences for both Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman losses were severe, and Mehmed II was forced to retreat. The psychological shock reverberated throughout the empire, demonstrating that European forces, when led effectively and reinforced by local commitment, could resist the Sultan's campaigns. For Hungary, the victory at Belgrade marked a resurgence in morale and strategic initiative. Hunyadi emerged as a national hero, revered not only for his martial skill, but for his embodiment of courage, leadership, and the synthesis of military and civic organization. Belgrade's survival also had significant strategic implications. The frontier gained critical breathing space, allowing Hungary to reorganize defenses, reinforce fortresses, and integrate lessons from the siege into broader military planning. Villages along the southern frontier could recover, farmers returned to fields, and local militias strengthened their coordination with garrisons. The victory demonstrated that the frontier's resilience depended on proactive leadership, professional military organization, and the active participation of civilian communities. It reinforced a model of integrated defense that would inform Hungarian strategy for decades. The social and cultural impact of the siege was equally profound. Religious and civic institutions reinforced the sense of collective identity. Reports of miraculous interventions, visions of saints, and communal prayers became entwined with historical narratives, imbuing the frontier with a spiritual dimension alongside its military significance. Chroniclers emphasized not only the heroism of Hunyadi and his professional soldiers, economically, the siege prompted both immediate and long-term effects. Short-term disruption included damage to fields, fortifications, and supply lines, but the eventual victory allowed communities to recover rapidly. Reconstruction efforts reinforced the integration of civilian labor into strategic priorities. Markets reopened, trade resumed, and craftsmen were employed in repairing walls, producing weapons, and maintaining infrastructure. The siege demonstrated that a resilient frontier required the simultaneous management of military, economic, and social resources, a lesson that would be vital in the centuries of conflict to come. Strategically, Belgrade became a cornerstone in Hungary's defensive network. Fortresses along the Danube and Sava were reinforced, and garrisons were coordinated through systems of communication and intelligence refined in response to the siege. The victory also influenced wider European perception. News of Belgrade's defense spread rapidly, reinforcing the idea that coordinated, disciplined, and determined defense could counter Ottoman advances. Hunyadi received recognition across the continent, and European rulers were reminded that Ottoman expansion, while formidable, was not. Hungary's frontier, long viewed as a vulnerable buffer, became a symbol of strategic ingenuity, resilience, and the capacity to resist one of history's most formidable empires. Yet the victory did not end the struggle. Ottoman forces would regroup, and the long-term strategic balance in the region remained contested. The siege of Belgrade demonstrated the potential for Hungarian resurgence, but also highlighted the persistent vulnerability of frontier regions. Villages, garrisons, and fortresses remained under constant pressure, and leadership, coordination, and adaptation were essential to sustaining security. The frontier was not static. It was a dynamic, contested space where the interplay of military, social, economic, and spiritual factors determined survival and resistance. Belgrade exemplified the intersection of these forces. The city's survival resulted from the integration of professional soldiers, local militia, civilian labor, and spiritual motivation under decisive leadership. It revealed the value of preparation, coordination, and intelligence in frontier warfare. It reinforced the principle that victories were achieved not merely through valor but through systemic adaptation, integrating all elements of society into a cohesive defensive strategy. Belgrade remained both a military and symbolic bastion. Its walls held not only against siege engines and cannon, but against the erosion of hope that centuries of conflict could produce. The fortress demonstrated that the frontier could endure, adapt, and occasionally prevail, offering a model for both defense and societal resilience. Its story became central to the narrative of Hungary as Europe's shield against the Ottoman Empire, illustrating the intertwined nature of military, civic, and spiritual life on the southern frontier. In conclusion, the siege of Belgrade in 1456 represents a turning point in Hungary's struggle against Ottoman expansion. Mehmed II's forces, formidable and relentless, were halted by a combination of leadership, strategy, and communal endurance. Hunyadi's defense showcased the integration of professional soldiers with local fortified infrastructure and civilian participation. The aftermath enabled Hungarian resurgence, reinforced frontier defenses, and established principles of coordinated, adaptive strategy that would guide Hungary for decades. Belgrade's story became emblematic of the frontier itself. A space of constant danger, innovation, and human resilience, where the fate of empires and communities alike hung in delicate balance. By the mid-15th century, the Kingdom of Hungary faced pressures unlike any before. Frontier settlements were battle-hardened from decades of raids, skirmishes, and full-scale campaigns. Yet, as the Ottoman threat continued to loom, the crown recognized that ad hoc responses, militia levies, and traditional feudal levies were no longer sufficient. Into this environment stepped Matthias Corvinus, ascending to the throne in 1458. His reign marked a transformation in Hungarian statecraft and military organization, producing a centralized, disciplined, and partially professional military system capable of confronting both internal dissent and the formidable Ottoman war machine. Matthias's most renowned innovation was the establishment of the Black Army, a standing professional force funded by a combination of crown revenues, new taxation measures, and centralized administration. Unlike feudal levies, which were temporary, locally organized, and dependent on the loyalty of individual nobles, the Black Army could be deployed year-round, trained to follow orders, and equipped with the latest weaponry. Its composition reflected the evolving nature of warfare in Central Europe. Infantry armed with handguns and pikes, heavy cavalry for decisive charges, and artillery units capable of supporting sieges or battlefield engagements. The Black Army embodied both the ambitions and the practical necessities of a kingdom caught between empire and frontier. Black Army also served as a symbol of Hungarian ambition and sovereignty. But also to consolidate control over contested regions, enforce royal authority over unruly nobles, and assert influence in neighboring Balkan territories. In doing so, he reinforced the perception that Hungary could act decisively, both strategically and politically, in a complex and contested landscape. The social impact of Matthias's military state was equally profound. Despite the sophistication of the Black Army, the kingdom could not entirely eliminate the threat posed by the Ottomans. Large-scale campaigns, whether defensive or offensive, were constrained by resources, logistics, and the need to maintain cohesion across a complex and multi-ethnic kingdom. Nevertheless, the framework, he established professional forces, fortified towns, coordinated militias, and centralized governance created a model that would influence Hungarian defense for decades. Frontier communities adapted to this new reality, learning to operate in coordination with professional forces while maintaining their own resilience and local capabilities. Matthias also leveraged the Black Army in his governance reforms to extend Hungary's influence beyond its immediate borders. Diplomatic initiatives in Bohemia, Wallachia, and the Balkan principalities were supported by the credible threat of military force. This projection of power reinforced Hungary's position as a central actor in regional politics, capable of both defending its territory and shaping the strategic landscape of southeastern Europe. The frontier thus became a zone not only of defense, but also of political assertion, reflecting the interplay between military capacity, statecraft, and frontier society. Culturally, the reign of Matthias Corvinus left an enduring imprint. The integration of frontier communities into a professionalized defense system influenced social norms, work patterns, and civic expectations. Villagers, soldiers, and administrators became accustomed to a rhythm of preparation, vigilance, and collaboration. Stories of military heroism, strategic ingenuity, and communal resilience circulated widely, reinforcing both morale and identity. Monastic and clerical chroniclers documented these transformations, preserving accounts of the Black Army's campaigns, the strategic reforms, and the resilience of frontier society. In conclusion, Matthias Corvinus' reign marked a decisive evolution in Hungary's confrontation with the Ottoman Empire. The creation of the Black Army, comprehensive governance and taxation reforms, and the integration of frontier communities into a coordinated defensive system transformed the kingdom into a new kind of military state. While the system had its limitations, it demonstrated the potential of centralized authority, professional forces, and strategic foresight in sustaining a frontier under constant pressure. Hungary, long the shield of Europe, now possessed both the organizational capacity and the tactical innovation to confront a resurgent Ottoman threat with unprecedented sophistication. The legacy of Matthias's reforms would extend well beyond his reign. Frontier fortresses remained key defensive nodes. Local militias continued to integrate with professional forces, and the structures of centralized administration influenced successive kings. The Black Army itself, though eventually diminished after his death, set a precedent for professionalized military service in Central Europe. Most importantly, the societal transformations he initiated, the integration of civilian, military, and administrative functions, created a resilient frontier culture capable of enduring the trials that would define Hungary's struggle against the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century. For Hungary, the implications were stark. The Western Balkans, which had previously acted as a buffer against Ottoman expansion, no longer provided sanctuary or strategic depth. Refugees, nobles, soldiers, and peasants flooded the southern frontier, bringing both human resources and logistical challenges. Villages strained to accommodate newcomers, while garrisons struggled to provide sufficient protection along an increasingly exposed border. The demographic shifts, combined with economic pressures, intensified the militarization of the frontier. Fortresses were reinforced, watchtowers multiplied, and local militias integrated more closely with professional forces. The very fabric of frontier society changed, as survival, defense, and adaptation became inseparable from daily life. The conquest of Bosnia also illustrated the broader Ottoman strategy of integration. Territories were not merely occupied, they were systematically absorbed into the imperial administration. The Timur system redistributed land to loyal soldiers, creating a network of local authority dependent on the Sultan. The collapse of the Western Balkans also had profound political consequences. Hungary's relative isolation increased, limiting opportunities for alliances and coordinated defense with neighboring states. Wallachia, Moldavia, and Serbia were now either under Ottoman suzerainty or compelled into submission, reducing the strategic options for Hungary. The southern frontier was no longer a line of defense against sporadic raids, but a front line exposed to the full capabilities of a consolidated Ottoman state. Economically, the frontier underwent transformation. Refugee populations increased demand for food, housing, and security, while ongoing Ottoman pressure disrupted trade routes and agricultural production. The collapse of neighboring regions underscored the importance of collective effort, adaptive leadership, and societal integration into the defense apparatus. Hungary's response required both innovation and resilience, integrating professional military forces with civilian defense, fortification, and intelligence networks. Militarily, the collapse of the Western Balkans emphasized the importance of fortresses and professional armies. Hungary's garrisons were reinforced, training intensified, and communication between forts formalized to allow rapid response to incursions. The frontier's survival depended on the integration of multiple layers of defense, combining professional, feudal, and civilian elements into a coherent strategic whole. The closing decades of the 15th century brought Hungary to a pivotal moment. The triumphs of John Hunyadi and the resilience demonstrated at Belgrade had provided breathing room. Yet Europe's eastern frontier was entering a period of uncertainty. The Jagiellon dynasty, ascending to the Hungarian throne after Matthias Corvinus's death in 1490, faced the immense challenge of consolidating a kingdom marked by decades of warfare, social adaptation, and a militarized frontier. The ambitions of the Ottoman Empire under Sultan Bayezid to further intensified pressures as the empire prepared to renew its campaigns with renewed resources, strategic vision, and long-term objectives that threatened to overwhelm a fragmented Hungary. The Jagiellon rulers inherited a kingdom both strong and fragile. Politically, Hungary had expanded and centralized under Matthias Corvinus, yet the mechanisms of authority were dependent upon personal loyalty, efficient administration, and the charisma of the king himself. And frontier communities accustomed to a high degree of autonomy. The kingdom's defensive capabilities remained formidable on paper, but internal cohesion was increasingly strained by competing interests, regional disputes, and the legacies of war. These internal fractures posed immediate challenges. Nobles asserted their prerogatives over taxation, military levies, and local governance, occasionally undermining the coordination necessary to maintain an effective frontier defense. Frontier communities, accustomed to the direct leadership of strong figures like Hunyadi, now faced uncertainty regarding both funding for fortifications and the provision of professional troops. The military innovations of the previous decade's professional armies, organized garrisons, and integrated militias risked losing effectiveness without consistent central support. Bayezid II's campaigns emphasized both direct conquest and indirect pressure. Diplomacy, alliances, and manipulation of local rulers complemented military operations. Vassal states including Wallachia and Moldavia were brought into alignment, reducing Hungary's buffer zones and ensuring that Ottoman campaigns could be sustained without interruption. The Jagiellon crown relied heavily on negotiation, compromise, and the enforcement of loyalty, which sometimes delayed decision-making and weakened rapid military coordination. Professional forces, including the remnants of the Black Army, required funding and administration that now depended on a crown less willing or able to impose central authority as decisively as Matthias Corvinus had done. Hungary remained strategically critical, its southern frontier, a gate through which empires clashed. Frontier communities, professional armies, and garrison fortresses were not merely military assets, they were the societal foundation upon which Hungary's survival depended. Each town and fortress played a role in a coordinated system of resistance. Yet the complexity of governance, diplomacy, and logistics meant that Hungary's defenses were as vulnerable to political weakness as to military assault. The late 15th century thus represents a moment of tension, adaptation, and foresight. The Jagiellon rulers, while less charismatic than Matthias Corvinus, inherited both the innovations and the vulnerabilities of a kingdom shaped by prolonged conflict. Bayezid II's Ottomans were both formidable and methodical, combining strategic vision with disciplined execution. Hungary's frontier, though resilient, faced a delicate balance. The integration of military, social, economic, and cultural systems was essential to countering an empire capable of both sudden strikes and sustained campaigns. The brewing storm highlighted that survival was no longer guaranteed by fortresses alone. It required systemic adaptation, leadership, and communal resilience. The early 16th century marked a turning point in the Ottoman-Hungarian confrontation, for it was in these years that a new ruler ascended the Ottoman throne, who combined ambition, discipline, and strategic clarity like few before him. Suleiman, later called the Magnificent, and the Lawgiver, entered power in 1520, with a vision that reached far beyond the empire he inherited. His rise reshaped the geopolitical balance of Europe, altered the rhythm of frontier warfare, and placed immense pressure on a Hungary already strained by political fragmentation and decades of border conflict. His reign would not simply continue expansion, it would redefine the scale and purpose of it. Suleiman was the product of a century of Ottoman institutionalism. He was born into a state that possessed a centralized administrative system, a disciplined army, a mobile logistical infrastructure, and a frontier ethos that celebrated conquest as both duty and destiny. Yet he approached rule not only as a conqueror but as an organizer. Chroniclers emphasized his keen intellect, his early exposure to provincial governance, and his disciplined training in state. When he became sultan at the age of 26, he inherited the most powerful military machine in Eurasia, along with the authority to direct it toward his ambitions. His strategic vision centered on consolidating Ottoman supremacy along three axes. First was the Mediterranean, where naval and territorial ambitions brought the Ottomans into conflict with Venice, Spain, and other maritime powers. Second was the Middle East, where the Safavid Empire challenged Ottoman claims and threatened its eastern frontiers. But the third and most dramatic axis lay in Europe, where the fortress lines of Hungary stood as both barrier and invitation. The geography's Central Europe, the vulnerability of the plains, and the political condition of Hungary made the region Suleiman's most promising theater of expansion. Hungary, during these years, was increasingly pressured by both internal instability and external demands. The Jagiellon kings struggled to manage deep fissures among nobles, magnates, and regional power brokers. The crown's authority weakened as competing families asserted influence, levied private forces, and resisted royal taxation. The frontier fortresses, once unified under the command of strong rulers, now suffered from inconsistent funding, shortages in supplies, and political interference. Some garrisons sold weapons to fund basic needs. Others relied heavily on local militias, whose loyalty depended on regional allegiances rather than royal command. This environment did not escape Ottoman notice. Observers, messengers, and commanders along the frontier recognized that Hungary's political fabric was weakening. Reports from Akonki scouts, diplomats, and frontier governors emphasized the disorder among the Hungarian nobility, the neglect of key fortresses, and disputes that prevented unified military response. What had once been a shield forged by unity and necessity now revealed cracks visible even to distant eyes. Suleiman recognized these vulnerabilities, not as temporary symptoms, but as structural weaknesses that could be exploited through strategic, sustained pressure. The strategic foundations of Suleiman's European vision were rooted in both ideology and practicality. Ottoman rulers had long embraced the concept of Gaza, a sacred and political mission to expand the realm of Islam. Though applied flexibly, this ideology provided legitimacy to expansion and unity to the elite core who prosecuted it. But for Suleiman, expansion into Europe also served pragmatic interests. European wealth, river systems, and fertile plains offered resources that could sustain imperial administration. Control of Central Europe would open pathways to Vienna and the Danube Basin, shaping continental politics for generations. Hungary lay directly in this path. As Suleiman consolidated power, preparations for major European expansion began. These preparations were not episodic, but systemic. Fortresses on the Ottoman side of the frontier were reinforced. Garrisons were reorganized, supply depots expanded, and roads improved to facilitate the movement of artillery. The Timur system was adjusted to ensure a steady flow of Sipahi cavalry. Janissary recruitment continued to fill elite regiments with disciplined infantry, skilled in firearms and siege warfare. Artillery foundries increased production to support campaigns against heavily fortified European targets. Administrative preparations complemented military ones. Governors in Rumelia received explicit instructions to monitor frontier conditions, assess Hungarian weaknesses, and ensure readiness for coordinated campaigns. Diplomatic envoys probed European courts, identifying potential allies, rivals, and moments of discord. Hungary felt the effects deeply. Frontier communities had long lived under uncertainty, but the rise of Suleiman transformed that uncertainty into constant vigilance. Chroniclers describe villages where families slept fully clothed, ready to flee at the sound of distant hoofbeats. Their votive garrisons drained by insufficient pay, their morale strained by both political neglect and increasing Ottoman incursions. Some locals fled northward, abandoning farms and vineyards that had sustained generations. Others fortified their homes, forming clustered defensive settlements that merged civilian life with military necessity. Political tensions sharpened. Hungarian nobles, aware of Sultan Suleiman's reputation and observing the empire's preparations, debated how to respond. Some demanded sweeping reforms and increased taxation to finance defense. Others resisted, fearing loss of privilege or exploitation by rivals. The crown sought compromise, yet compromise often resulted in delay. The military might that Hungary required demanded unity. Instead, the kingdom faced division. Meanwhile, Suleiman's intentions became increasingly clear. Early in his reign, he launched successful campaigns against Belgrade and Rhodes, both actions, sending a message to Europe that the young sultan was neither hesitant nor untested. The fall of Belgrade in 1521 was particularly devastating for Hungary. It removed a critical defensive anchor at the confluence of the Sava and Danube rivers. Belgrade had been a bulwark for nearly a century. Its loss exposed central Hungary to direct Ottoman advance and signaled the start of a new era in the confrontation. The strategic implications were profound. With Belgrade gone, Ottoman forces possessed an open corridor into the heart of the Hungarian plain. Fortresses that once relied on Belgrade's support now stood isolated. Communication networks faltered. Panic spread through frontier villages already exhausted by decades of conflict. Suleiman, through a single decisive strike, transformed the regional balance. From this point onward, Hungary existed under continuous, escalating pressure. Ottoman forces probed deeper, testing defenses, identifying weaknesses, and securing logistical footholds. Suleiman balanced these military initiatives with diplomatic efforts to prevent Hungary from forming powerful alliances, correspondence with European rulers, manipulation of internal Hungarian disputes, and cultivation of rival claimants to the throne allowed the Ottomans to weaken their opponent without committing massive force prematurely. This patterned military pressure, diplomatic maneuvering, and exploitation of internal instability was the hallmark of Suleiman's European strategy. It revealed a leader who understood that conquest of Hungary required not only battlefield victory but political calculation. The kingdom's disunity offered opportunities that battlefield prowess alone could not provide. Economically, Hungary's vulnerabilities grew. Markets faltered under the strain of disrupted trade routes. Agricultural production declined in regions most exposed to attacks. Fortification repair required resources that the crown struggled to secure. Soldiers went unpaid. Supplies dwindled. As Suleiman expanded control over former Balkan territories, he gained access to new resources and manpower that Hungary could not match. Ottoman logistics became increasingly efficient, while Hungarian support structures deteriorated. In this context, Suleiman's rise marked not only the ascendance of a powerful ruler, but the emergence of a coordinated imperial strategy aimed at reshaping Central Europe. Hungary, weakened by internal disputes, strained by frontier pressures, and deprived of key defensive positions, faced an empire determined to push forward with disciplined, methodical intent. By the mid-1520s, the storm that had long been gathering along the frontier was ready to break fully. Suleiman's preparations were nearly complete. His armies were positioned, his commanders informed, and his strategic vision clear. Hungary, though still courageous and capable, was now exposed to the full weight of an empire unified under a young, ambitious sultan. And so, the next chapter of the conflict was set not as a sudden clash, but as the consequence of decades of tension, adaptation, miscalculation, and ambition. Suleiman's rise turned pressure into inevitability. The frontier trembled under the weight of the coming storm. The early 16th century in Hungary unfolded as a slow, grinding descent toward catastrophe. Even before the thunder of Ottoman cannons echoed across the fields of Mohács, the kingdom was already buckling under the weight of internal discord, political indecision, and the relentless pressure exerted by the expanding empire of Suleiman. The road to that fateful battlefield was not paved in a single year, nor by a single misstep. It was a long, steady accumulation of fractures economic, political, military, and moral that converged into one of the most defining defeats in European history. Hungary's political crisis was not abrupt. It was the result of decades of erosion. After the death of the powerful Matthias Corvinus, the kingdom had fallen into the hands of weaker monarchs whose authority never matched the institutional gravity required to maintain a frontier state. King Vladislas II, often called King Welies, for his tendency to approve the demands of magnates without resistance, embodied a monarchy increasingly controlled by the nobility rather than the crown. This imbalance weakened the kingdom's central administration and hollowed out its ability to respond swiftly to the Ottoman threat. When Vladislas II died in 1516, his successor, Louis II, was only 10 years old. A minor on the throne of a frontier kingdom was not merely a political inconvenience, it was a geopolitical vulnerability. A regency council governed in the king's name, but this council was plagued by internal rivalries. As political authority fractured, so too did the military system. The once fearsome, defensive network that had held back Murad II and Mehmed II was now a patchwork of undermanned outposts. His intelligence networks relayed detailed reports about Hungary's weaknesses, political conflicts, unpaid soldiers, dilapidated fortresses, and rivalries among magnates. Hungary, by contrast, struggled to muster unity. The young Louis II matured, but his authority remained constrained by the magnates who had grown accustomed to governing during his minority. By the early 1520s, Ottoman probes into Hungarian territory intensified. These were not mere raids, but strategic tests. Suleiman wanted to gauge Hungary's response capacity, assess garrison strength, and measure political cohesion. Each probe confirmed the same pattern. Hungary was slow to mobilize, internally divided, and reliant on regional leaders rather than a national command. Frontier lords acted heroically, but heroism without unified strategy could not repel an empire. Hungarian envoys returned with assurances, yet frontier captains observed troop movements and supply columns on the Ottoman side. Diplomacy became a vehicle for delayful to Hungary, perhaps, but even more useful to Suleiman, as he prepared for a full-scale invasion. Reports from Balkan territories indicated that roads were being cleared, river crossings reinforced, and provisioning organized months in advance. It was clear to any observer that Suleiman intended not a punitive expedition, but a war of conquest. Hungary responded with urgency, But urgency could not compensate for years of political fragmentation. The Diet attempted to raise funds and mobilize forces, but disagreements between magnates and the crown slowed progress. Some nobles insisted that the king wait for reinforcements from the Habsburgs. Others argued for an immediate march south to confront the Ottomans before they reached the Danube. Frontier captains warned that they lacked the troops to hold the line. Bishops demanded prayer and fasting. Merchants debated where to store their goods. Peasants fled northward, their villages stripped of supplies to feed the mobilizing army. When Suleiman crossed the Drava River in the summer of 1526, the invasion was swift, coordinated, and overwhelming. The Ottomans moved with calculated precision, their columns advancing along well-prepared routes. Hungarian scouts reported the scale of the invasion, yet these reports only deepened the divisions among the kingdom's leaders. Should the army retreat to defensive positions? Should it attempt to block the Ottoman advance at river crossings? Should it wait for allies? The debates continued even as Suleiman's forces marched forward. Ultimately, the decision was made to confront the Ottomans. Before they reached Buda, the Hungarian army gathered on the plains near the small town of Mohács, a location chosen for its open fields and the hope that Hungarian cavalry could maneuver effectively. Yet the army that gathered there, though brave, was incomplete, lacking key contingents, proper coordination, and sufficient artillery. It was the product of a kingdom that had the will to resist, but lacked the unified structure to do so successfully. The invasion of 1526 was not the beginning of Hungary's collapse. It was the final act of a long unfolding tragedy. The political crises, the weakened monarchy, the internal rivalries, the failed diplomacy, and the relentless Ottoman pressure all converged on that field. The Hungarian kingdom faced an empire prepared, unified, and determined, while Hungary entered the battle divided, under-resourced, and rushed into a confrontation it was not structurally prepared to win. The plains of Mohács awaited, silent and vast, as the two forces moved toward the battle that would reshape the destiny of Central Europe. The summer of 1526 marked the end of an era that had lasted for centuries. Generations of Hungarians had held the frontier, resisting the slow, relentless expansion of the Ottoman Empire. They had fought under the banners of kings, captains, and noble houses. And the power of an empire whose rise had been long foreseen yet never fully understood in its magnitude. As Suleiman the Magnificent marched northward early that summer, the scale of the Ottoman host stunned even seasoned frontier captains. Chroniclers recorded a moving city of soldiers stretching across plains and hillsides, with elite infantry, disciplined cavalry, heavy artillery, and long supply trains fed from the wealth of an empire that spanned 3 continents. Suleiman was not leading a punitive expedition or a retaliatory raid. He was leading a campaign of conquest, designed not merely to punish Hungary but to reshape Central Europe. Hungary, in contrast, entered the campaign in a fractured state. The nobility was divided, the treasury strained, and the military system deeply weakened by years of political instability and lack of cohesive leadership. King Louis II, though earnest and personally courageous, was young, inexperienced, and surrounded by advisors whose rivalries often eclipsed the urgency of national defense. When news came of Suleiman's approach, the kingdom scrambled to mobilize forces, but coordination was slow. Nobles mustered their retinues separately. Communication faltered, and valuable time was lost debating strategy at a moment when unity was a matter of survival. Bilate Augusta Hungarian army gathered near Mohács, a broad plain south of the Danube. It was not an ideal defensive position. The terrain favored fast-moving cavalry and disciplined infantry troops that the Ottomans possessed in overwhelming numbers. But the Hungarians had few alternatives. Retreat risked political disgrace and strategic disaster. To yield ground without a fight would expose the heart of the kingdom. When the two armies finally faced each other, the Hungarians were heavily outmatched. Their forces numbered perhaps 25 to 30,000 brave soldiers, but many were poorly coordinated, and their artillery was both limited and slow to deploy. The Ottomans numbered nearly twice as many, supported by cannons capable of reshaping the landscape and janissaries trained with unmatched discipline. The imbalance was immediately apparent, yet Hungarian commanders, aware that delay could only worsen their position, attempted a bold strategy. A rapid, concentrated charge designed to break the Ottoman vanguard before the full force of the army could deploy. The charge was courageous. Knights and infantry advanced with determination, striking the forward elements of the Ottoman line and creating momentary disorder. But the moment could not be sustained. As Hungarian forces pushed forward, they found themselves funneling into marshy ground and uneven terrain. The Ottomans had prepared for this. Janissaries opened ranks to reveal massed artillery. A single, devastating volley shattered the momentum of the Hungarian charge. Horses fell in heaps. Knights disappeared in clouds of dust and debris. Infantry lines broke under the thunder of cannon fire that echoed across the plain. The collapse began slowly, then accelerated with terrifying speed. Ottoman Sipahi cavalry swept around the flanks, cutting off retreat and isolating units. Those who tried to reform their lines found that the ground beneath them was already clogged with the dead and the wounded. Commanders attempted to rally their men, but the chaos was too great. Sections of the Hungarian army began to disintegrate, and panic rippled outward as soldiers realized they were in. King Luis II, only 20 years old, remained on the field. Chroniclers later wrote that he fought bravely, refusing to abandon his troops. But as the army dissolved and Ottoman forces closed in, he was compelled to flee. In the confusion, his horse stumbled in a muddy ravine. Weighted by armor, he drowned. His body later found by villagers who had ventured onto the battlefield after the storm of war had passed. His death symbolized more than royal tragedy. It marked the end of Hungary's medieval monarchy. The casualties at Mohács were staggering. A significant portion of Hungary's nobility fell in a single afternoon. Bishops, magnates, and frontier captains who had spent their lives defending the kingdom perished alongside peasants, mercenaries, and militia. The loss was not just military, it was societal. Entire leadership structures disappeared in a single day, leaving villages, fortresses, and counties without guidance or protection. For the Ottomans, Mohács was a decisive victory, achieved with strategic precision. Suleiman observed the battle with the calm confidence of a commander whose preparations had been meticulous. He understood that the power of his empire lay not only in its soldiers, but in its logistical and administrative depth. The aftermath confirmed his expectations. With the Hungarian army destroyed, there was little to prevent the Ottomans from pushing deeper into the kingdom. Fortresses surrendered or fell quickly. Towns were left defenseless. The road to Buda lay open. The psychological impact was immense. Mohács became a word synonymous with catastrophe, echoed across chronicles, sermons, and diplomatic correspondence. For Hungary, the battle represented not just defeat, but the shattering of a political order that had endured since the founding of the kingdom centuries earlier. The unity that had once defined Hungary's defense of Europe dissolved, replaced by uncertainty, competing claims to the throne, and foreign interventions. The collapse of medieval Hungary was not solely a military event, it was a structural collapse of governance, identity, and geopolitical stability. In the months that followed, the kingdom fractured. Two rival claimants emerged, one supported by the nobility seeking stability, the other backed by foreign powers seeking influence. The Ottomans exploited the division, consolidating their gains and preparing for further interventions. Hungary's once formidable network of frontier fortresses, stretched thin and lacking central coordination, could not resist effectively. The kingdom entered a period of prolonged instability that reshaped the political landscape of Central Europe. The consequences of Mohács extended far beyond the battlefield. The loss of leadership left regions vulnerable to famine, lawlessness, and population displacement. Peasants fled from advancing armies, abandoning fields and homes. Nobles who survived the battle scrambled to secure their estates, negotiate alliances, or seek refuge in safer territories. The administrative vacuum deepened, creating conditions that allowed the Ottomans not only to conquer, but to govern. Yet even in the shadow of disaster, Hungary's story did not end. The collapse of medieval structures made way for new forms of resistance. Local commanders, fortified cities, and surviving noble families reorganized, forming the seeds of the long frontier war that would follow. Though the kingdom was broken, its people did not surrender. The loss of Mohács forced Hungary to rebuild itself under pressures unprecedented in its history, and from that rebuilding emerged a new, hardened frontier society. The Battle of Mohács thus stands as a turning point. The moment when centuries of accumulated strain erupted into irreversible transformation. It was the culmination of pressures that had been building since the early Ottoman presence in Europe, the fragmentation of the Balkans, the fall of neighboring states, the rise of Sulaiman's war machine, and internal fractures that weakened Hungary from within. It was also the beginning of a new era, one defined by occupation, resistance, and the forging of identities that would shape the region for centuries. The medieval kingdom lay in ruins, but its people endured. From the ashes of Mohács emerged a new chapter, one in which Hungary's struggle would continue not as a united medieval state, but as a divided, wounded land determined to survive the empire that now loomed over it. The catastrophe at Mohács did not simply end a battle. It ruptured the very foundation of medieval Hungary. With the king dead, the army broken, and much of the nobility either slain or scattered, a vacuum opened at the center of the kingdom. Into that vacuum poured not only fear and uncertainty, but also ambition, desperation, and foreign influence. What followed was not a brief succession dispute, but a prolonged civil conflict, one that intertwined with Ottoman strategy and reshaped the fate of Central Europe. The struggle for the Hungarian throne revealed that the battlefield defeat of 1526 was only the beginning of a more profound disintegration. The death of Louis II at Mohács left Hungary without a clear heir. The Jagellan line, which had ruled the kingdom since the late 1400s, ended in an instant as the king's horse sank in the marshes during the chaotic retreat. Every chronicler who wrote about the aftermath described the same feeling across the country. A suspended breath, an airy silenza, a realization that the kingdom no longer had a sovereign to unify its institutions. Yet the political fracture was not merely accidental. 4 years before, Mohács factions within the nobility had debated the succession, disagreed over reform, and resisted centralization. Now, with the king gone and the kingdom devastated, these divisions rose to the surface. Two powerful figures emerged, each claiming legitimacy. The first was John Zapolia, voivode of Transylvania, a wealthy magnate with considerable military experience and a loyal following among eastern and central nobles. His support base argued that he was the natural defender of the realm, experienced in frontier warfare, and positioned to lead reconstruction. The other claimant was Ferdinand of Habsburg, brother of the Holy Roman Emperor, whose claim came through dynastic marriage treaties. Ferdinand promised support from Austria and the empire, offering not only legitimacy in the eyes of many Western nobles, but also the possibility of resources for rebuilding Hungary's shattered defenses. Each side held a coronation. Zapolia was crowned first in November 1526, backed heavily by nobles from eastern and central regions who feared foreign domination more than internal reform. Ferdinand was crowned only weeks later with the blessing of Western magnates and the support of the Catholic hierarchy. From that moment, two kings ruled one kingdom, neither recognizing the other's authority. The Hungarian state was split geographically, politically, and ideologically, even as the Ottoman Empire watched from the south, waiting for the opportunity to shape events to its advantage. The civil war that followed reflected not only personal rivalries, but deep structural problems. The political landscape was fragmented by regional loyalties, economic pressures, and competing visions for Hungary's future. Zapolia supporters emphasized sovereignty and the preservation of Hungarian independence. Many believed that a native king would be more capable of mobilizing local support and negotiating with the Ottomans, if necessary. His enemies, however, feared that his alignment with Ottoman will would compromise Hungary's position and reduce it to a vassal state. Ferdinand's followers viewed Habsburg support as essential for survival, convinced that only a powerful foreign ally could prevent total Ottoman conquest. Yet others feared that Habsburg influence would submerge Hungary within a broader imperial system, eroding its autonomy. The conflict escalated as each side sought to strengthen its military position. Zapolia, though possessing strong personal support, lacked the resources to match Ferdinand's imperial backing. Yet he had something Ferdinand did not: proximity to the frontier, familiarity with Balkan warfare, and the goodwill of many who feared Ottoman retaliation should the kingdom align too closely with Vienna. His strategy relied on mobilizing Transylvanian levies, frontier militias, and loyal nobles, using mobility and terrain to offset Ferdinand's more structured forces. Ferdinand's forces, drawn partially from Austrian and imperial holdings, were better trained and equipped, reflecting the Habsburg tradition of disciplined military organization. He also possessed greater diplomatic leverage, appealing to European courts that saw the Ottoman threat as a continental concern. The conflict between the two claimants quickly spilled into armed confrontations, sieges, shifting alliances, and regional disputes. No single battle decided the matter. Instead, a wearying series of campaigns gradually eroded the kingdom's capacity to resist external pressure. The Ottomans, observing the internal division, recognized an opportunity. Suleiman the Magnificent, victorious at Mohács, understood that Hungary's fracture could become a strategic advantage. Rather than immediately annexing the entire kingdom, he pursued a more subtle approach, supporting whichever claimant would weaken the other and maintain Hungary in a state of manageable instability. Zapolia, facing immense pressure from Ferdinand's forces, sought Ottoman assistance as early as 1528. His envoys traveled to Constantinople, appealing to Suleiman for recognition and military support. The decision that followed fundamentally changed the nature of the civil war. Suleiman recognized Zapolia as the rightful king of Hungary, promising military support in exchange for allegiance. This agreement effectively transformed the civil conflict into a proxy struggle, pitting Habsburg-backed forces against Ottoman-backed Hungarian loyalists. The kingdom became a chessboard for two great empires, its internal divisions magnified by the geopolitical interests of Vienna and Constantinople. Ottoman armies entered Hungary again in 1529, not to conquer the kingdom outright, but to reinforce Zapolia's claim. Suleiman's forces drove Ferdinand's troops from key fortresses and restored Zapolia. Chroniclers describe the eerie irony of the situation: Hungarian soldiers fighting under an Ottoman banner against other Hungarians supported by Western powers. The tragedy underscored how deeply the kingdom had fractured. Ottoman intervention provided Zapolia with temporary security, yet it also marked a transformation in Hungary's sovereignty. While he remained king, his position now depended on the goodwill of an expanding empire. Ferdinand, refusing to accept defeat, conducted counter-campaigns throughout the early 1530s. He secured western fortresses, reinforced the Austrian frontier, and appealed to the Holy Roman Empire for additional support. His strategy focused on containment, preventing Ottoman influence from spreading into western Hungary, while consolidating his authority in the regions nearest the Austrian heartlands. The conflict reached moments of equilibrium, but never resolution. The two-king system persisted, draining resources, dividing loyalties, and preventing the kingdom from rebuilding the shattered defenses left after Mohács. The Hungarian nobility remained divided. Some switched allegiance multiple times, driven not by ideology but by survival and shifting local conditions. Others attempted to mediate between the two claimants, recognizing that prolonged civil war would only deepen the kingdom's vulnerability. Yet the centrifugal forces were stronger than the centripetal ones. The kingdom's administrative institutions deteriorated. Tax collection became inconsistent, military coordination suffered, and fortresses fell into disrepair. Refugee populations from the southern counties remained displaced, their villages abandoned or destroyed, the very social fabric that had held frontier society together during earlier centuries. Of Ottoman pressure now, frayed under the strain of internal conflict. The Ottomans deepened their influence with each passing year. They conducted raids into central Hungary, tested fortresses, and assessed political loyalty in various regions. While maintaining the appearance of supporting Zapolia's sovereignty, they positioned themselves as the ultimate arbiters of his authority. His regime, though recognized by many, increasingly relied on Ottoman military presence to maintain control over contested areas. The cost of such dependence was not merely political. It placed Hungary's eastern and central lands under the shadow of Ottoman strategic planning, setting the stage for deeper intervention in the years ahead. Ferdinand, for his part, increasingly viewed the defense of Western Hungary as a component of broader Habsburg security. His strategy evolved into one of consolidation rather than total conquest. He recognized that reclaiming the entirety of the kingdom was not feasible, while Ottoman forces supported. Instead, he focused on establishing a defensible western central zone that could serve as a bulwark against future Ottoman expansion. By the early 1530s, the outlines of a divided Hungary had begun to solidify. The civil war had not resolved the succession, but had instead institutionalized fragmentation. Zapolia ruled much of the central and eastern regions under Ottoman protection, while Ferdinand controlled the west with Habsburg support. Neither side could decisively defeat the other, and both were vulnerable to the pressures exerted by the great empires that backed them. Thus, the struggle for the throne was not merely a dispute over succession. It was the process by which medieval Hungary broke apart, transforming from a unified kingdom into a fractured land whose fate was increasingly shaped by external powers. The tragedy lay not only in the conflict itself, but in the realization that the kingdom's internal divisions had become inseparable from the geopolitical ambitions of Vienna and Constantinople. The struggle that began in the marshes of Mohács would culminate, in the decades ahead, in the partition of Hungary, an outcome forged as much by internal rivalry as by foreign conquest. The summer of 1541 stands as one of the most transformative moments in Central European history. It was a turning point not marked by a single battle, nor by a decisive clash of armies in open fields, but by a quiet, meticulous act of imperial strategy. It was the year the Ottoman Empire captured Buda, Hungary's ancient capital, without a full-scale war, without a prolonged siege, and without the dramatic spectacle chroniclers usually favored. Instead, the fall of Buda unfolded through deception, political exploitation, and the subtle brilliance of a state that had learned how to manipulate weakness as effectively as it wielded swords and cannons. The story begins with the vacuum left after the catastrophic Battle of Mohács in 1526. The Hungarian kingdom, devastated and leaderless, fragmented into rival factions. One supported Ferdinand of Habsburg, Archduke of Austria, who claimed the throne through dynastic ties. The other supported John Zapolia, the last major magnate with deep roots in Hungarian political life. Their rivalry split the kingdom into two competing courts, two competing visions, and two competing claims to legitimacy. By the late 1530s, John Zapolia's position had weakened dramatically. His rule depended on Ottoman support, and although he had gained recognition in central and eastern Hungary, his authority was always fragile. The Ottomans viewed Zapolia as a useful instrument, someone who could keep the Habsburgs off balance and maintain political chaos within Hungary. So long as Hungary remained divided, it could not present a unified front against Ottoman expansion. When John Zapolia died in 1540, the delicate balance of power shifted. His death left behind an infant son, John Sigismund, whose guardians attempted to secure his inheritance. But no infant could secure a throne in a land already battered by war, internal division, and Ottoman pressure. Ferdinand saw the opportunity to finally unify the kingdom under his crown and began preparing military action to seize Buda, the symbolic and administrative center of Zapolia. The Ottoman Empire, under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, saw the situation differently. For 2 decades, Suleiman had watched Hungary tear itself apart, while his own forces consolidated power in the Balkans. Supporting Zapolia had served its purpose, but now with a vulnerable child at the center of the political storm, the Ottomans recognized a new opportunity, one that would allow them not merely to influence Hungary, but to take direct control of its heartland. Suleiman launched a campaign in 1541, officially declaring it a mission to protect the infant John Sigismund from Habsburg aggression. This framing allowed him to move armies northward without provoking immediate escalation with the Habsburgs. The Ottomans portrayed themselves as guardians, not conquerors. They marched openly, deliberately, and with the confidence of a power that understood the weakness of its rivals. Ferdinand's forces reached Buda first. They attempted to besiege the city and overthrow the faction that supported the infant king. But the garrison was determined, reinforced by Hungarian nobles loyal to Zapolia's lineage. When Suleiman's army approached, Ferdinand's troops withdrew in the face of overwhelming numbers. They knew that confronting the Ottoman field army directly would risk annihilation. The Habsburg retreat appeared orderly, but it left Buda exposed, isolated, yet still in the hands of the infant king's defenders. Suleiman arrived in Buda in late August and entered with a calculated gentleness. Reports describe warm gestures, assurances of protection, and the appearance of a monarch fulfilling a promise to an old ally. The city's leaders, believing the Ottomans had come to help stabilize the region, welcomed Suleiman with ceremonial respect. They trusted in his previous support for Zapalia and believed he intended to preserve their autonomy. But the Ottomans operated with a strategic subtlety that far exceeded the factional politics of the Hungarian nobles. Their true intention was not protection, it was possession. On a morning that would alter the future of Central Europe, Suleiman invited the leading nobles and commanders to a meeting outside the city walls. Some accounts say it was presented as a review of fortifications. Others describe it as a diplomatic gathering. Whatever the official reason, key Hungarian leaders left the city to attend the meeting. At the same time, Ottoman janissaries began to enter Buda under the pretext of guarding the city and protecting the young king. Their movements were deliberate and disciplined. No violence erupted. No struggle unfolded. The janissaries dispersed through strategic positions, gates, towers, arsenals. By the time the Hungarian nobles realized what was happening, Buda was already effectively in Ottoman control. When the nobles attempted to return, they found the gates shut. Ottoman soldiers lined the walls. Suleiman sent word that Buda was now under his direct protection and that the city would henceforth be administered by the empire. The infant king and his mother were relocated, not harmed, but placed under Ottoman supervision. It was an occupation achieved, not through brute force, but through psychological acuity. Suleiman understood Hungary's divisions better than the Hungarians themselves. He knew their rivalries, their desperation, and their inability to resist a unified, disciplined empire. His strategy turned their fragmentation into his opportunity. The fall of Buda marked the final breaking of medieval Hungary. The ancient capital, seat of kings, for centuries, was now part of the Ottoman world. Its churches, palaces, and guild houses became assets of an imperial administration. The Danube, once a symbol of Hungarian sovereignty, now flowed through a city bearing the banners of the consequences of that day reshaped the political map of Europe. Hungary was no longer a single kingdom but three distinct political entities. The first was Royal Hungary. The Habsburg-controlled western and northern regions. This territory became a borderland of a different kind, fortified and militarized to resist further Ottoman expansion. Vienna now lay uncomfortably close to Ottoman-controlled territory, shifting the strategic center of Habsburg defense westward. The second was Ottoman Hungary, the central region governed directly by the empire. This territory included Buda and a corridor of fortified towns stretching along the central Danube. Ottoman administration transformed taxation, military obligations, religious life, and landholding patterns. The region became one of the most contested and fortified spaces in Europe. The third was the Principality of Transylvania, governed nominally by John Sigismund under Ottoman suit. Though politically complex, Transylvania remained semi-autonomous, a buffer state shaped by diplomacy, negotiation, and the constant balancing of Habsburg and Ottoman pressure. These three Hungaries emerged from the same historical crises, yet developed distinct identities and the once unified medieval kingdom disappeared almost instantly, replaced by a tripartite division that would endure for more than 150 years. For ordinary people, the consequences were profound. Families found themselves suddenly living under new rulers, new tax burdens, and new legal systems. Some regions adapted quickly to Ottoman administration, particularly where trade and agriculture could be stabilized. Others struggled under the weight of garrisons, requisitions, and the constant threat of conflict along the shifting frontier. The fall of Buda was not merely a political turning point, it was a civilizational fracture. It marked the moment when the medieval Hungarian state ceased to exist, and when Central Europe entered a new era, defined by empires rather than kingdoms, by dynastic power rather than national identity, and by frontier militarization rather than internal stability. For the Ottomans, the capture of Buda was a strategic triumph that solidified their presence deep into the Carpathian Basin. For the Habsburgs, It was a warning, a realization that their eastern flank was now exposed to a relentless and resourceful adversary. For Hungary, it was the end of an age, the loss of a historic capital, and the beginning of a long period of division, war, and survival. The storm that had brewed since Mohács now reached its crescendo. What followed would be a century of sieges, raids, shifting alliances, and grinding frontier war, a contest that would shape the political, cultural, and military evolution of Central Europe for generations. The middle of the 16th century opened upon a Hungary that no longer resembled the unified kingdom that had once stretched confidently across the Carpathian Basin. The catastrophe at Mohács had shattered political order. The fall of Buda in 1541 had extinguished any hope of swift restoration. What emerged instead was a tripartite realm, three Hungaries, each shaped by different sovereignties, administrations, and fates. This religious landscape added complexity to governance diplomacy, and social cohesion. Frontier peasants, whether Protestant or Catholic, remained primarily concerned with defending their homes, cultivating their fields, and navigating the demands of Habsburg administration. The military presence created a unique frontier society. Garrisons consisted of German, Czech, Croatian, and Hungarian soldiers, forming multi-ethnic communities bound by shared danger and daily routines. Officers coordinated patrols, raids, and reconnaissance missions, while locals provided supplies and labor. The ever-present possibility of Ottoman incursions shaped all aspects of life. Farmers planted crops near fortified areas for protection. Herders kept livestock ready to flee at a moment's notice, and villages maintained alarm systems, watchmen, and defensive ditches. Royal Hungary became not merely a political territory, but a living, breathing, defensive organism. To the east rose the Principality of Transylvania, an autonomous state under Ottoman suzerainty, yet governed by Hungarian elites. This region, mountainous and diverse, offered a very different experience from both Central Ottoman Hungary and Habsburg-controlled Royal Hungary. Protected by its terrain and political flexibility, Transylvania emerged as a refuge for Hungarian nobility, scholars, and religious groups seeking stability amid the chaos of partition. Transylvania's rulers, often elected from leading noble families, walked a delicate path. They accepted Ottoman overlordship, paid tribute, and coordinated policies to avoid outright conquest. Society was shaped by interdependence between nobles, peasants, and merchants. The political structure allowed local governance to flourish, with communities maintaining traditions, laws, and economic practices that differed from both Habsburg and Ottoman models. Villages were relatively insulated from the constant threat of invasion, though border skirmishes and diplomatic tensions remained part of life. The principality's leaders understood the fragility of their position and sought to preserve autonomy through negotiation, tribute, and careful military preparedness. The existence of three Hungaries produced a complex web of loyalties, identities, and experiences. Families divided across borders, adapted to different administrations. Merchants traveled between regions carrying goods and stories, linking the territories through threads of shared culture. Soldiers from Royal Hungary sometimes fought alongside Transylvanian allies, while peasants in Ottoman territories corresponded with relatives living under Habsburg rule. Despite political fragmentation, the Hungarian identity endured, shaped by memory, tradition, and the shared trauma of Mohács and Buda. The Ottoman-administered central region adapted through practical accommodation and integration into imperial systems. Royal Hungary embraced militarization and Habsburg administration as a shield against further loss. Transylvania preserved autonomy through diplomacy, culture, and flexible governance. Each region developed distinct strengths, challenges, and societal models, yet all remained tied to the broader fate of the Hungarian people and their long confrontation with the Ottoman Empire. The tripartite division did not end war. It transformed it. Skirmishes, raids, and sieges continued along the shifting frontier lines. Diplomacy intertwined with conflict as each polity navigated the pressures of empire, ambition, and survival. And while the medieval kingdom had fallen, a new era began, one defined not by unified sovereignty, but by the resilience of a people spread across 3 realms, each adapting to a world reshaped by conquest and collapse. The mid-16th century through the early 17th marked one of the most grueling periods in the long struggle between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. Historians often call it the Long Frontier War. But for the people who lived along the fractured border, it was less a single war than an unending season of tension and exhaustion. It stretched across generations. It shaped childhoods and broke families. It created a world where raids, reprisals, ambushes, and siege warfare became part of daily existence. The frontier was no longer simply a line on a map. It was a living, breathing zone of conflict, fluctuating with every campaign, every firelit assault, every negotiated surrender, every winter of hunger, and every summer of renewed destruction. Raids defined the rhythm of life in Ottoman-controlled Hungary and the border with Royal Hungary. Ottoman light cavalry, often led by frontier lords who held timberlands in the region, conducted swift strikes into Habsburg territory. Their goals varied. Sometimes they sought prisoners who could be ransomed or sold. Sometimes they aimed to destroy harvests before they could be gathered. Sometimes they tested the garrisons of small forts, and sometimes they rode to provoke fear, to remind the Christian frontier that the empire's reach was long and its vigilance constant. These raids were often executed with precision. Scouts surveyed villages. Horsemen avoided main roads, traveling along riverbeds or forest paths. By the time bells rang and smoke rose, the raiders were already retreating with captives and spoils, moving with practiced efficiency back toward their fortified bases. Counter-raids were the Christian answer, mirroring Ottoman tactics. Hungarian, Croatian, and German troops, sometimes royal soldiers, sometimes local militias, sometimes irregular bands who operated on the margins of legality, launched their own strikes into Ottoman territory. These raids sought the same objectives: captives, spoils, the destruction of supplies, the burning of enemy outposts. For many frontier households, the line between soldier and farmer blurred. Men who worked the fields during the planting season might join a mounted counter-raid in the autumn. They learned to survive not only by defending their land, but by striking preemptively across the border. These raids were dangerous. The Ottomans had strong intelligence networks, and ambushes were common. But for frontier communities, counter-raids were necessary. Without them, the frontier would tilt irreversibly in favor of the empire. Fortress warfare became the backbone of this long period of conflict. Neither the Ottomans nor Royal Hungary could easily launch a decisive invasion. Instead, they fought over networks of forts, towers, palisades, riverside strongholds, and stone castles that dotted the frontier. Each fort was both a defensive bulwark and a deeply human world. Life inside them was defined by hardship. Soldiers endured cramped quarters, erratic pay, poor food, and constant vigilance. Letters from the period describe garrisons subsisting on coarse bread, dried meat, and whatever provisions they could extract from surrounding villages. Winters were especially brutal. Fires were rationed. Walls cracked under frost. Water froze inside barrels. Yet the garrisons had to remain alert, for winter was often when smaller raids or probing attacks occurred. Many forts developed distinct identities, shaped by their commanders, their soldiers, and the surrounding communities. Some became known for their fierce discipline, others for the loyalty between garrison and nearby peasants. The relationships between soldiers and locals mattered. Peasants provided food, information, and labor. In return, soldiers protected the more tried. Sometimes the protection failed. Frontier villages could be wiped out in a single raid. Survivors rebuilt, often relocating closer to a nearby fort, forming clusters of communities whose existence revolved around military necessity. The Ottomans maintained their own frontier fortress network, staffed by a mixture of janissaries, local timber-holding cavalry, and auxiliary troops. Their forts were supplied through a system that combined imperial logistics with local taxation. These fortresses acted as staging points for raids and as barriers against Habsburg incursions. The Ottoman frontier was also highly organized. Its commanders kept detailed records, monitored enemy movements, and negotiated with Christian frontier captains through temporary truces that were often broken when strategic advantage beckoned. The frontier was a place of both war and tense diplomacy, where envoys could arrive one day and scouts report enemy movements the next. The burden of this long frontier war fell most heavily on ordinary soldiers. They lived lives marked by monotony, broken by sudden violence. Months could pass without incident. Then alarms would echo across the walls, and the fort would spring to life. Soldiers rushed to their posts. Archers prepared their bowstrings. Musketeers cleaned their matchlocks. Cannon crews rolled artillery into position. Many attacks were brief, probing attempts to test defenses or draw out the garrison. Others were serious assaults, involving ladders, sappers, and sustained fire. Siege warfare remained a threat, though full sieges were costly and often reserved for strategically critical strongholds. Small forts might hold dozens of soldiers. Major ones held hundreds. Innate-case defenders knew that surrender rarely offered good outcomes. Many chose to fight to the last. Villagers, too, lived under the shadow of this unending conflict. Peasants worked their fields while keeping one eye on the horizon. Women and children learned the sound of distant hoofbeats and the sight of dust rising on the horizon. Entire generations grew up expecting danger at any moment. Harvests were fragile. A single raid could destroy a year's worth of work. Taxes were heavy, imposed by whichever authority controlled the area. Some communities found themselves paying dues to both Ottoman and Habsburg officials, attempting to balance survival with loyalty. Religious life continued, but priests and ministers often doubled as chroniclers of tragedy, recording the destruction of villages or the bravery of common folk. Yet amid the hardship, frontier society developed remarkable resilience. Villages rebuilt quickly. Communities learned to cooperate across ethnic and linguistic lines. Hungarians, Croatians, Serbs, Germans, Slovaks, and others lived side by side, bound not only by proximity but by a shared struggle for survival. The frontier became a cultural mosaic shaped by tension, adaptation, and the necessity of strength. Songs, folktales, and local legends carried stories of heroic defenders, cunning scouts, and farmers who outwitted raiders. These tales served both as morale and as warnings for future generations. Military technology evolved rapidly in this environment. Fortifications incorporated new designs to withstand gunpowder artillery. Cannon placements became more refined. Musketeers and arquebusiers grew in number, supplementing traditional bowmen. Cavalry remained critical on both sides, especially for raids and counter-raids. Light cavalry units, Hungarian hussars, and Ottoman akinji became symbols of speed, agility, and frontline mobility. Their clashes shaped the frontier's rhythm as small bands tested each other across the landscape. Diplomacy periodically interrupted the violence, but truces were often fragile. Treaties might bring a year or two of relative calm, allowing communities to rebuild and armies to recover. But ambitions, provocations, or shifts in leadership quickly reopened the wounds. Both the Ottomans and the Habsburgs viewed the frontier as a zone where pressure could be applied without triggering full-scale war. A place where advantage could be gained incrementally. This meant that true peace remained out of reach. The frontier lived in a liminal space between open warfare and uneasy quiet. Throughout this long period, the psychological toll on the population was immense. Soldiers wrote letters expressing exhaustion, longing for home, and fear of abandonment by distant rulers. Villagers described sleepless nights, the anxiety of unknown riders approaching, and the despair of rebuilding again and again. Chroniclers recorded entire regions where population numbers plummeted, not only from war but from disease, hunger, and migration. Many families fled northward, seeking safety in towns or cities deeper within Royal Hungary or into neighboring lands. Others staged, bound by land, tradition, or necessity. Despite everything, the frontier held. It held not because of grand armies marching in triumph or decisive victories that swept away danger. It held because countless small acts of endurance accumulated across generations. Farmers who returned to their fields after raids. Soldiers who stood watch on freezing nights. Women who kept households together while their husbands served in distant garrisons. Priests who maintained faith in burned-out churches. Children who grew up learning the cautionary lessons of frontier life, yet chose to remain. The frontier was maintained by the persistence of ordinary people whose resilience became the true bulwark of Hungary. By the time the frontier war moved toward the next major phase of conflict, Hungary had endured decades of relentless pressure. The Ottomans had solidified control over central regions. Royal Hungary had fortified its defenses. Transylvania maneuvered between submission and autonomy, yet the core dynamic remained unchanged. A divided kingdom resisting a relentless empire through fortresses, raids, counter-raids, and the unyielding determination of its frontier people. This period forged identities, hardened borders, and prepared the ground for the great confrontations of the later 16th century. By the mid-16th century, the Hungarian frontier had become a landscape defined less by decisive battles than by prolonged, grinding attrition. Generations of peasants, soldiers, and frontier communities had endured raids, counter-raids, sieges, and the constant strain of living in a militarized zone. The Ottoman-Hungarian conflict, once punctuated by landmark engagements like Mohács or the siege of Sigismund, evolved into a century-long struggle marked by incremental losses, exhaustion, and social transformation. And rebuilt, and the flow of trade along rivers, roads, and mountain passes was perpetually disrupted. Markets that had once thrived in frontier towns shrank, and artisans struggled to maintain production in regions constantly threatened by raids. Taxation, whether imposed by Habsburg administrators in Royal Hungary or Ottoman authorities in the south, was both a burden and a lifeline. It funded fortifications, garrisons, and armies, yet drained already strained communities. Over time, this economic exhaustion diminished the capacity of frontier settlements to recover fully between campaigns, creating cycles of devastation and fragile renewal that persisted for decades. Waves of forced migration, refugee flight from Ottoman advances, and the high mortality of military campaigns emptied villages and reduced the availability of labor essential for agriculture and fortification maintenance. Families who survived the immediate violence often found themselves isolated, with fields untended and communities fragmented. In some regions, abandoned settlements were absorbed into forests or reclaimed by the wilderness, erasing centuries of human habitation. Chroniclers frequently lamented the disappearance of entire villages, leaving only memory and ruined stone walls to testify to a once thriving society. Churches and monasteries often serve dual purposes: spiritual guidance and logistical support, providing shelter, supplies, and coordination for both soldiers and civilians. Religious identity became intertwined with survival, fortification, and community cohesion. Pilgrimages, liturgical celebrations, and local rituals adapted to the realities of frontier warfare, blending devotion with vigilance and integrating faith into the daily rhythms of life under constant threat. The war's human toll was perhaps most visible in the lives of soldiers and villagers alike. Military service, whether in professional garrisons, local militias, or temporary levies, was relentless. Soldiers endured harsh campaigns, shortages of food and supplies, and exposure to disease. yet they were often the only shield against Ottoman incursions. Villagers, in turn, adapted by learning to construct makeshift fortifications, maintain lookout posts, and coordinate with professional forces. Children grew up understanding the rhythms of raids. Families trained in emergency evacuation, and entire communities developed intricate systems for warning, shelter, and defense. Life in these frontier zones required perpetual adaptation, a collective memory of past losses, and a pragmatic approach to both fear and hope. Raids and counter-raids remained central to the century of attrition. Ottoman Akonki units, highly mobile and expert in psychological as well as physical warfare, struck villages, disrupted supply lines, and spread terror. Hungarian defenders responded with local militias, fortified strongpoints, and small-scale offensive operations designed to harass and delay the invaders. These engagements were rarely decisive. Success was measured in the preservation of lives, the survival of crops, and the temporary denial of resources to the enemy. Chroniclers recorded countless skirmishes, often noting the bravery of frontier populations alongside the staggering losses they endured. Walls deteriorated under repeated siege and bombardment. Garrisons faced shortages of both manpower and supplies, and commanders had to adapt to new forms of Ottoman warfare, including improved artillery and coordinated multi-pronged assaults. Maintenance of fortifications required constant labor from both soldiers and villagers, integrating construction, repair, and vigilance into daily life. Some strongholds survived and became symbols of resilience, while others fell repeatedly, serving as grim reminders of the costs of prolonged warfare. The landscape of the frontier was thus both militarized and scarred, a testament to endurance as much as to human ingenuity. The psychological impact of a century of attrition cannot be overstated. Communities lived under constant uncertainty, knowing that each season could bring new raids, famine, or disease. Families mourned repeated losses. Children grew up amid ruins and garrison towns, and cultural memory became infused with narratives of endurance, heroism, and suffering. Chroniclers, poets, and clerics preserved these experiences, blending historical observation with moral and spiritual reflection. Despite these pressures, efforts to survive were multifaceted and adaptive. Military adaptation emphasized mobility, intelligence gathering, and coordinated defense rather than reliance on a single decisive battle. Civic organization became intertwined with military planning, with councils, guilds, and religious institutions contributing to the maintenance of fortifications, supply distribution, and morale. Education, religious instruction, and cultural traditions were maintained even under duress, reflecting a commitment to continuity and identity amid the chaos of war. The century of attrition also reshaped political structures. Frontier governors, garrison commanders, and local nobles exercised authority in ways that balanced autonomy with loyalty to the crown or Ottoman administrators. Depending on jurisdiction, decision-making became decentralized, adaptive, and highly responsive to immediate threats, reflecting the realities of constant engagement. These structures contributed to resilience, but also underscored the fragility of centralized power in a region marked by perpetual conflict. The frontier was both politically complex and strategically vital, a microcosm of the broader challenges facing Hungary and its neighbors. Faith was inseparable from daily life. It provided solace, structured time, and a framework for understanding the trauma of centuries of war. Religious observances were not merely ceremonial, they reinforced communal cohesion, supported defensive efforts, and offered moral grounding for a population that had witnessed repeated devastation. Military culture, forged over generations, remained central. The professional armies of the Black Army era had evolved into smaller, more locally embedded garrisons, militia systems, reinforced by fortresses, and integrated into regional defense networks, preserved the knowledge and skills of frontier warfare. Cavalry units patrolled borderlands. Watchtowers communicated threats across valleys, and artillery positions maintained readiness. Experience accumulated across generations informed strategy and tactics. Yet the fundamental reality persisted. Survival depended on perpetual adaptation, coordination, and vigilance. But administrative integration, tax extraction, and the establishment of durable governance. The frontier became a zone of imperial oversight rather than solely a battlefield. Ottoman commanders coordinated garrisons, monitored local populations, and conducted raids primarily to assert authority, maintain supply lines, and project power. The nature of the threat had changed from episodic raids to systemic occupation, demanding new responses from both the Habsburgs and Transylvanian authorities. The generational memory of war was perhaps the most enduring legacy. Children who had been born into conflict grew up learning the skills necessary for survival. The construction of fortifications, the operation of small arms and artillery, the organization of local militias, and the practical integration of daily life with military preparedness. Oral histories, chronicles, and religious texts preserved narratives of courage, sacrifice, and loss. These stories shaped collective identity, informing behavior, social expectations, and even marriage and settlement patterns. The frontier was both a physical space and a cultural one, embedding the experiences of centuries into the consciousness of communities. The transition to early modern Eastern Europe was inseparable from this frontier experience. Even as the 121-year struggle formally ended, its effects endured in the landscape, architecture, and social memory. Fortresses dotted riverbanks, hilltops, and plains, often rebuilt multiple times, a testament to both destruction and renewal. Villages carried the legacy of repeated raids and reconstruction, with communal bonds forged through necessity. Trade networks, though disrupted, had adapted to the realities of a militarized economy. Clerics, chroniclers, and storytellers codified memories of heroism, loss, and endurance. The Hungarian-Ottoman frontier was no longer merely a contested zone, it had become a model of endurance, a testament to human resilience under sustained pressure, and a crucible for the transformation of early modern Eastern Europe. 121 years. More than a century of unbroken conflict, stretching across generations, etched into every stone of fortresses, every ruined village, and every worn path along the Carpathian frontier. It is a span of time that reshaped lives, altered landscapes, and forged identities. The struggle between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire was not merely a series of battles. It was a continuous test of endurance, a prolonged confrontation between two worlds, two empires, and the countless human stories caught between them. For 3 generations, families lived under the shadow of war. Children were born into a world of watchtowers and garrison towns, taught from their earliest days the rhythms of vigilance, flight, and defense. They learned to read the horizon for signs of raiders, to recognize the distant thunder of horse hooves, to understand that survival demanded both courage and cunning. Fathers and mothers endured loss, laboring to rebuild homes, tend fields, and fortify villages, even as fear gnawed at the edges of daily life. Each generation bore the trauma of the last while, preparing the next for the inevitable return of violence. The human cost of these wars is almost unimaginable. Countless villages were razed, populations displaced, and livelihoods destroyed. Soldiers fell not only on battlefields, but in skirmishes, ambushes, and sieges, often far from their families. Peasants carried the weight of taxation, conscription, and forced labor. Refugees wandered from burned fields to overcrowded towns, navigating the complex realities of survival in a landscape constantly reshaped by war. Chroniclers and monks recorded these losses, yet no ledger could capture the full scale of grief, resilience, and determination that defined frontier life. And yet, amid destruction, there was endurance. The Hungarian people, and the frontier communities in particular, adapted to conditions that would have broken many others. Fortifications were rebuilt, strategies refined, and new generations trained in the arts of defense and survival. Professional armies and local militias worked in tandem with civilians to protect lives and lands. Even in Ottoman-administered territories, communities found ways to preserve identity, maintain faith, and navigate the challenges of foreign rule. Survival became both a moral imperative and a practical necessity, woven into every aspect of daily life. The frontier itself shaped the very essence of Hungarian society. It became a laboratory for adaptation, innovation, and integration. Fortresses, garrisons, and watchtowers were not merely military installations. They were centers of community, coordination, and cultural continuity. Villages became militarized, but also resilient hubs of production, craft, and social organization. Trade, agriculture, and religious observance were all reconfigured to accommodate the realities of living at the edge of an expanding empire. The frontier transformed ordinary people into participants in a long-term strategic endeavor, embedding lessons of endurance and vigilance into the very fabric of society. The legacy of resistance is equally profound. Hungary's ability to hold the line, to adapt and survive, delay Ottoman expansion into Central Europe, and preserve the integrity of European civilization in a region that might otherwise have been entirely absorbed. Herat stands from Belgrade to Sigeva became emblematic of the courage, leadership, and sacrifice that defined frontier warfare. These were not just military victories, they were affirmations of human resilience, cultural persistence, and the capacity to endure against overwhelming odds. The names of commanders, soldiers, and even anonymous villagers became part of a living memory, carried forward in chronicles, oral histories, and the landscape itself. Religious life, though tested by the ravages of war, also endured and adapted. Churches, monasteries, and mosques continued to serve as spiritual anchors, social organizers, and moral compasses. Faith provided a framework for understanding the chaos of the frontier, for sustaining hope amid loss, and for shaping community cohesion. Religious observances were integrated with practical measures of survival, fortification, defense, and communal solidarity. Across generations, belief became inseparable from life on the frontier, providing both moral guidance and a shared sense of purpose. The frontier experience had lasting implications for European history. Hungary's defense shaped the strategic balance of Central Europe, delayed Ottoman expansion, and influenced the development of military, political, and administrative systems. The innovations born of necessity: professional armies, integrated militias, fortified towns, and adaptive governance provided models for other regions confronting similar pressures. The lessons of endurance, coordination, and resilience extended beyond the battlefield into the social, economic, and political spheres of early modern Europe. Hungary's frontier became both a shield and a proving ground, demonstrating how societies could survive, adapt, and influence history even under relentless pressure. Generational memory was central to this process. Stories of raids, sieges, heroic stands, and endurance were passed down, creating a shared narrative that shaped identity, behavior, and cultural norms. Children learned not only survival skills, but also a sense of duty and communal responsibility. Adults carried forward the lessons of their predecessors while preparing the next generation for the ongoing realities of frontier life. Memory became a tool of both strategy and culture, ensuring that experience, resilience, and identity were preserved even as the landscape of war shifted and changed. As the 121-year struggle drew to a close, the scars of war remained visible. Ruins of fortresses, depopulated villages, and transformed landscapes testified 2 centuries of unrelenting conflict. Yet in these scars lay the markers of resilience. Communities had rebuilt repeatedly, adapted to constant threat, and maintained social cohesion in the face of extraordinary challenges. Survivors carried forward a collective wisdom, integrating military, social, and economic knowledge into the foundation of a society prepared for the uncertainties of the early modern era. The emotional weight of this history is immense. Generations endured uncertainty, loss, and fear, yet also demonstrated courage, creativity, and solidarity. The frontier became a crucible in which identity, culture, and survival were tested and reformed. The stories of ordinary people, peasants, craftsmen, soldiers, refugees, and clergy intertwined with the actions of kings, generals, and sultans, creating a tapestry of human experience that is both epic in scale and intimate in detail. The endurance of these communities is a testament to human adaptability, courage, and moral fortitude. In reflection, the 121-year Hungarian-Ottoman struggle is more than military history. It is a chronicle of survival, adaptation, and identity. It shows how societies confront overwhelming pressure, integrate experience across generations, and preserve cultural and social cohesion under duress. The frontier experience shaped Hungary, influenced the course of European history, and left a legacy of resilience that extends far beyond the battlefield. It reminds us that endurance, courage, and adaptability are as vital to human history as strategy, power, and conquest. As the frontier stabilized and Europe transitioned into the early modern era, the lessons of the Hungarian experience endured. Fortresses, garrisons, and militarized communities remained, but so too did the knowledge, culture, and memory of generations forged under fire. Hungary's role as a bulwark of Europe was secured not just through armies or battles, but through the collective endurance of its people, the adaptation of frontier communities, and the integration of social, economic, and military strategies into a coherent system of survival. The story of 121 years of conflict is ultimately a story of the human spirit. It is a story of fear faced with courage, of devastation met with reconstruction, of uncertainty navigated with communal wisdom. It is a story that binds generations together, shapes identities, and leaves a lasting imprint on both landscape and memory. The Hungarian-Ottoman frontier stands as a testament to endurance, a living reminder that even in the darkest centuries, societies can survive, adapt, and influence the course of history. In the end, the memory of this period belongs to everyone who lived through it, and to every generation that inherited its consequences. The courage, ingenuity, and resilience of those who faced unrelenting pressure across the Carpathian frontier resonate beyond their time. Their experience teaches us about survival, adaptation, and the enduring capacity of human communities to navigate even the longest and most harrowing periods of conflict. The 121-year struggle is a chapter in European history, but it is also a universal story of endurance, identity, and the human will to survive.